I don't think it's any exaggeration to say that both the Dead Space and Resident Evil franchises, specifically the over-the-shoulder action horror era, are two of my favorite game series of all time. I know that's a common thing for a lot of channels to say, but they usually mean it as in the games were good back in the day. When I say it, I genuinely mean it as in these are the games I grew up on. The games I was raised on. This era in gaming is the one I have the most nostalgic attachment to. The kind of nostalgic attachment you may find on a more classic horror enthusiast channel. I still remember my mom bringing home the Resident Evil 4 Game Informer with Leon on the cover, wondering who this was and why he just looked so cool. When I cover the original Resident Evil 4, I'll tell y'all about the tale of how I got into Resident Evil in general with Resident Evil 4. I don't want to waste it on a video covering the remake. But long story short, we had a PlayStation 2 already, but I begged until I got a Nintendo GameCube specifically for this game. I did play the PlayStation 2 version later, but I'll never forget that initial 2-disc experience of getting to the game's third act and having to swap the discs. That heartbreak of the second disc just not working one day after about 1 million replays of this game. Resident Evil 4 came out when I was 8 and was so groundbreaking that almost every single third-person game still uses its identity as the framework. It's so important to the franchise that it has become the standard for almost every single game since, to the point Capcom backpedaled on the whole returning to the roots idea and straight from their mouth decided the direct sequel to 7 would play more like 4 and everything that came after it. Dead Space to me is just as special, just as great. Because Dead Space took what Resident Evil 4 did, turned all the lights out, and said have just as much fun. I remember again seeing screenshots of it in Game Informer and thinking to myself, it looked like Resident Evil 4 in space. And that's basically what it was. Resident Evil 5 came out around the same time and was also a fantastic game, building on 4's combat loop and expanding the scope. But Dead Space here was something special in what it did. I haven't gotten to covering the Resident Evil franchise yet, but I do have a pretty lengthy video covering the Dead Space trilogy already. They were still ironing out the kinks and getting their formula down for the first game, and there was massive plot holes and stuff that will be retconned in later entries, but it's still a very good game. This game came out when I was around 12, so again, I grew up on it. I remember heading to the library and computer labs at school all the damn time, looking for any info I could on Dead Space 2. After playing the original, seeing all the fan trailers and edits in their community section, it's just prime nostalgia for me to look back on. I love this franchise the same way I love Resident Evil. Dead Space is just unfortunately a smaller, less successful name that while I grew up on and argue was just as good and even better in some areas than Resident Evil, just could not compete sales-wise with a franchise that had a 12-year head start on it. So seeing remakes of some of my favorite games and that they would be dropping only a couple of months apart was insane. I cannot do how crazy this is justice. Again, these are the games I replayed over and over again as a kid, and here they are back in their glory, back in the hands of the next generation of gamers that have came after me, presented true to their original identity and withstanding the test of time at their core, launching to wide praise and crushing sales figures. So, as I've been shifting my YouTube content more towards my own gaming analysis and discussions, I decided to talk about the both of these. I could have done it like everyone else and just dropped a review on Dead Space Remake when it first came out and then another one on Resident Evil 4's remake. But what could I have even added to that discussion other than to be another channel with nowhere near the size of some of the others to tell you that they're both good? Now, what I want to do is examine both of these games, what they change, what they do better or worse, and which one I think comes out on top as far as the better remake. Here's the thing though, the internet is a place full of dumb people. I mean absolute fucking morons. So I already know before I start this discussion in full drive that I need to make something clear. And as I discuss more and more games over this channel, I know I'm going to have to repeat this, but one game being arguably better or worse than the other does not make the other game bad. nor does it make it disappointing in comparison to whatever you're comparing it to. You put two of the most proficient fighters in the world in a one-on-one fight and someone has to lose. It might not even be the same person who loses on a different day. The bottom line is that they're both great at what they do, but again, someone has to lose when they go head to head, even if they are both great. I can't believe I even have to say this, but in this day and age when anybody can go buy a fucking microphone and then slut out a hate bait video hopping on the latest trend to try to get as many views as they can, this is something that I really have to drill in. If a game isn't as good as something else, but it's still a good game, it's still a good fucking game. Even when I compare games in the same franchise, this is the mentality I go into playing games with, and I enjoy myself much more because of it. I wish this was a more common mentality so that I didn't have to listen to people bitch and moan and go full drama queen and blow every game's flaws out of proportion, as the Resident Evil fanbase in particular is especially notorious for having meltdowns and eating each other alive over perceived flaws. But that is a video for another time and another game. For now, since Dead Space came out first, that's the game I'll start with. Be warned from here on out that I will discuss these games in my usual style of being raw with spoilers swinging every which way like a jogger's balls, and likely at some point I will insult one of your favorite content creators for saying something astronomically fucking stupid, as I tend to do. And some of you probably won't make it out of this video alive without feeling personally attacked by some of the stuff I say, as I have no intention of being quote-unquote professional or being at the mercy of this platform for a job, and am therefore safe from any muzzle that prevents me from being able to call stupid people stupid. And we'll also be addressing the controversies in politics, which tends to make some people sensitive. So this is your warning. If you can't handle that, this is your time to exit stage left. The rest of you saddle up. I'll be perfectly upfront with you guys. I was personally more excited for the Dead Space remake. Admittedly, I do like Dead Space a bit more than Resident Evil, but given that the original Resident Evil 4 was chomping right on Dead Space 2's ass, damn near right behind it as my favorite action horror game of all time, I don't think that counts as a bias. But as far as reveals go, Dead Space just looked to be a bit more faithful to the original based off of what was shown. It also looked like it was doing everything I wanted them to do if they remade it in the first place. For starters, most important of all, Isaac has a voice now. And it's gonna write again. This is fantastic. Not that I've ever really had a problem with this, it is what it is, but Resident Evil has a habit of recasting actors as time goes on. Most of them picking up the legacy of a character and doing them justice, and some of them, not so much. I couldn't imagine anyone else voicing Isaac. He's modeled after him. And he has really taken this character to heart, understood him, and built him into an icon. And I bullshit you not, he has not missed a beat in the 10 years it's been since he worked on Dead Space 3. This is Isaac as you know and love him from the later games. He reacts to things as you would expect him to react based on what we know of his character, and just like me, he's a fucking swear machine. Something some people have clearly forgot, because I've seen some criticism from those less mentally fortunate about how edgy Isaac comes across because he uses a bad word, or about how there's cutscenes now.
In the remake, we're treated to a cinematic cutscene in which a fire extinguisher seemingly explodes for no reason. This doesn't make you feel helpless, it just makes you wonder why was the control taken away from the player, and what the hell is Isaac doing? I'm really scared that some of the best moments of the game where the player had full control are going to be turned into cinematic cutscenes to appeal to the God of War audience.
To me. What did it say, Isaac? What did it say to you, Isaac? Isaac, you're in terrible danger.
There you are, Isaac. We've been waiting for you.
Now it's your turn.
This is not the way it was supposed to happen.
Well, how was it supposed to happen,
We
Tybin?
had it under control.
Clarke, this is not our fault.
Get on to my next subject, which is Isaac speaking. I'm gonna be blunt with you guys. I hate it. Isaac sounds like every horror protagonist these days, saying fuck every 2 seconds. It feels like they saw that meme of the new Silent Hill 2 dialogue, and they thought that that was actually a good way to write a horror protagonist. Here are some of the worst examples. Beware that there are spoilers from here ahead.
Fuck me! Ugh. Transmitting codes now. I saw it, Hammond. A flying one turned the captain's body into another one of those things.
Another one of those things! What great writing.
Put it that way, you and your marker can go to hell.
Why should I trust you?
Because I'm not the one shooting at you.
Fuck. Dana, your fucking route didn't work. There's a security lockdown.
I told you to hurry. How'd you miss it?
Look, I don't need your help.
Fine. Let's see how long you last out.
What the fuck?
Dana, I think I found the exit, but it's way above me. Gravity controls are locked out. Dana? Fuck! God damn it, I trusted you! Fuck you! And fuck your marker!
Do these glue snorting motherfuckers even remember Dead Space 2? Seriously, what do they have in the water over there that is melting your brain? Keep that shit away from me. Cabin fever. Because it is clear as day that what they've done here is bring Dead Space 2 and 3's story presentation and delivery into the remake. Dead Space 2 is one of the first games that I remember doing this whole cutscene plays over the character's shoulder thing that most games do now. And it's still to this day impressive to me how smoothly these transition in between gameplay, cutscene, and back again. The only change from that this time around is that to stay true to the original suit's physiology, Isaac has to manually take his helmet off instead of folding it down like he does in later games. He only takes his helmet off a couple of times outside of the ending, and it's only really when talking to his crewmates, but it's nice to see. It's good to be walking around with Isaac, the main protagonist of the Dead Space series, and not Isaac, the silent, walking errand boy, like we originally got. The biggest disappointment for me in this remake would have been if they didn't give Isaac a voice. In addition to Gunnar, we have Tanya Clarke returning to voice Nicole for the first time since Dead Space 2. This is an excellent decision as well, as it's no longer completely jarring going from Dead Space 1 Nicole to Dead Space 2 Nicole. I think everybody else taking on a voice for a character is new. Hammond, for example, has a new voice actor that isn't bad but lacks his accent. But I can live with that. I don't break down into tears just because roles were recast, like certain kinds of gamers. As long as the new actor is respecting the character's original interpretation, even if they want to take it in a slightly different direction. I give every voice actor, new or old, their fair shake, without bias, and they either do or don't do their role justice, and for the most part here, just about everyone does. It's been 15 years since the original. You'd have to be a crackhead to think the original voices would return for everybody. But them going out of their way to get the two most important actors for this game to make the transition from Dead Space 1 to 2 as smooth as possible deserves praise. Especially Tanya's work at the end of the game, where she speaks to Isaac exactly how she would speak to him towards the end of Dead Space 2.
Me. Us. Working together.
Step 4.
Yes. Are you ready?
This is gonna hurt, isn't it?
Yes. Step inside.
I'm good.
Are you afraid, Isaac?
No. With you, I can handle anything.
One more ride together, then.
She hasn't skipped a beat in talent either. This is the part of the video where we have to address the controversy regarding this game. Regarding Tanya, the wokeness, and all that. So if that's something you don't want me to talk about, I don't know what to tell you besides tough tits. This is also going to be a bit of a long rant, so we can get it out of the way, be done with it, and can actually talk about the games in my usual style without me having to stop and discuss every little controversy on a case-by-case basis. Dead Space Remake is being accused of being woke because of shit I could not fathom caring about. For starters, let's talk about the posters around the Ishimura, the bathrooms and all that. Dead Space is a game with an AI system that dynamically adjusts the game based on a million different things, to a point that a room that was empty the first 4 times you played could have 1 or 2 enemies pop up on your 5th run of the game. And the shit that has you hot and bothered, that you're paying attention to, is not any of that, but that you saw some diversity on a goddamn poster. I didn't even notice this kind of shit until I saw a Twitter clip of Synthetic Cuck here, of course, complaining about it and the world being brainwashed to not care. Does the anti-woke brigade realize at this point that they're essentially 2 sides of the same dumbass coin? I mean, seriously, ask yourself, what is the difference between if you had walked into a room in this game and seen a unisex bathroom sign instead of a gender-neutral bathroom sign? Nothing. Literally nothing. The end result of what the sign meant would still be the same. Everyone who walks in can use the bathroom. That's the point. But here Synthetic Man is, cradled in a fucking corner, mentally broken, hyperventilating, shaking, rocking back and forth, mumbling to himself, because he saw some other races on a poster, or a bathroom sign he didn't like, so he's having trouble escaping to his little soy-fed fairy tale land, that wraps its arms around him, kisses his forehead, and tells him everything will be okay, that other races don't exist, and that transgender people aren't a thing. Do you need some fucking testosterone booster? Holy shit, dude, man the fuck up. Now that we've dusted that dumbass argument, let's discuss the controversy surrounding the idea that the women, specifically Nicole, have been uglified in the Dead Space remake. Have you ever heard or read some shit so stupid, so dumb, that you don't even know where to begin dismantling it? Because that's how I feel about this no-globe brain ass claim. I don't know what the fuck Melanie Mack here is babbling on about, but she's not the only one saying this for some reason. The characters are based on the actor's likeness. In Dead Space 1, Isaac is 47. Nicole is around his age. If she wasn't, that would still be fine. This whole age gap thing is nobody's business besides 2 consenting adults that can do or date whatever and whoever the fuck they want, but she's meant to be around his age. In Dead Space 1, this really wasn't that big of a deal because 1, Isaac didn't ever take off his helmet or talk, and 2, look at this motherfucker, he's got baby face. You could tell me he was 26 to 30 and I'd believe you. In Dead Space 2, when they gave Isaac a voice, they decided to make him and Nicole actually look their ages. I don't think what Isaac's age was in Dead Space 1 was actually solidified and confirmed until this game, due to them having to create an entire hospital profile for him. But the problem of Nicole's kind of fixed itself through Gunnar Wright taking on Isaac's role and Tanya taking on Nicole's role. The graphics of this age were still just not as detailed as they are now. So this came out mid PS3 era, so a lot of characters still looked pretty young even when they were meant to be older. Again, Isaac and Nicole look what, 30s at best? And Isaac is meant to be around 50 in Dead Space 2. With that information in mind, those of you with an at least average functioning brain that doesn't have the texture consistency of a bottle of lemon pledge, ask yourself, what is more likely? That Nicole has been uglified as some sort of tinfoil hat behind the scenes agenda to make woman not pretty? Or do you think perhaps it is way easier to make her and Isaac actually look around their ages thanks to graphical technology improving since 2008, and that the actual actors are around the ages they're intended to be now? So it's way easier to just sit them in front of their face capture devices and capture accurate depictions. Now granted, yes, they have retconned Isaac and Nicole's ages to be older in the series history, but that happened over a decade ago. This isn't some woke mob change. Whether or not Nicole is pretty to you now is such a stupid fucking reason to take points off of a game being good, I shouldn't even need to tell you that. I'm sorry Nicole is under a bit of stress, being that the whole colony of people below the ship are dying, The medical deck is swarming with injured for her to work on, and she's trying to find a way to stop the mutations in the outbreak, so she may have forgotten to put on her makeup for the past couple of days. But when she does, I'd argue we're still in MILF territory here. As far as Kendra being uglified, you are out of your fucking mind. Look at her. I'm gonna give Melanie Mack the benefit of the doubt here and assume that somebody gave her bad info just to get her surface level uninformed judgment to get that YouTube algorithm going, and that she doesn't really know jack shit about Dead Space and just kind of halfway researched Nicole's appearances and made a video on it. That's fair. But then again, I don't see any video on how Leon has been visibly aged up to look more his age in Resident Evil 4, but Ada here still looks like she hasn't aged one day since Resident Evil 2 Remake. Oh, what's that? You said you can't feed off the views and clicks of dudes who keep My Little Pony cum jars in their closets by pointing out that kind of thing? My apologies, I forgot. And that leads me to this Vera Dark chick while we're at it, since I might as well address the Resident Evil 4 censorship controversy too. Because if you could mute channels, this one would be in the top 5 of my list, so I'd never had it show up again in my feed, ever, when I type a game's name in YouTube. She tends to just be Young Ye if Young Ye was twice as fucking obnoxious and twice as much of a clout chaser, while putting in about an eighth of the effort. I've never in my life seen anyone leave out so much context, backstory, and logic behind certain things that go on in an attempt to seem like they're for the people and the greater good. Let me give you an example. I remember when Dead or Alive 6 was coming out, and this was the game series known and laughed at by the general fighting game community for just being a Coomer nerd's wet dream. Nobody took it seriously, and it could barely ever be promoted due to sponsors wanting nothing to do with it, or wanting to advertise around it. It was actually pulled off of a stream one time for being too sexy, and she knew about this and tried to spin the narrative, like she always does, in regards to the devs making costume changes, like their hand was not being forced to make them. Dead or Alive 6 didn't really nerf the sexuality, it just covered up the default costumes a bit, and put the women in skimpy outfits that were slightly more covered up without the tits all damn near flopping out all over the fucking place. So that A, the fighting game community would take it a bit more seriously, and B, if the game was at any tournaments where the more erotic costumes weren't tournament legal, they still have the defaults to fall back on and aren't completely stuck out of the loop, unable to be streamed because sponsors didn't want to be associated with it. All information she didn't feel was worth including in most of her videos on it, because her narrative only works if the research is half-assed. She doesn't play or watch a good portion of the game she talks about. It feels like she just wakes up in the morning, types in some key phrases like gaming censorship, diversity, woke, and any other hot new word to find a new controversy to viciously milk for about 5 to 10 videos until she damn near rips the udders off. And the cow fucking moves for mercy, while cherry picking articles and comments she finds on the internet to respond to. And here with Resident Evil 4 remake coverage, clearly absolutely nothing has changed. The ability to look up Ashley's skirt has been completely removed, and of course that's prime pickings for Vera here. Because what that means is for 2 months she can wring the situation dry, and then never talk about it again when it turns out it's nowhere near as bad as she made it out to be. Ashley is the president's daughter and a university student at what we can likely assume would be one of the top colleges she could ever possibly be at. Instituting mandatory uniforms is something certain schools do, and it's not uncommon to require students who choose to wear skirts instead of pants to actually have to wear skirts. The private school I went to in middle school did this same thing, and one of the high schools I went to also did this. As far as censorship goes, in this particular case, it's not that big of a deal or out of place. In the Resident Evil 3 remake, that was a different story. When I talk about that game, I'll reiterate this point, but if, like Claire in the Resident Evil 2 remake, you want to update Jill's outfit to be a little less ridiculous, that's one thing. The issue is when you provide the audience with the classic costume and then fuck it up by making it a skirt instead. That is what an actual problem looks like. Ashley was not kidnapped walking down the street to Walmart. Krauser posed with a team as her bodyguards for the day and picked her up from school. Even beyond that, the game has a model viewer where Ashley and Ada's tits and ass jiggle all over the place, so it's not like the game doesn't have fan service. But this chick often takes what would be a pretty reasonable message on censorship and proceeds to clobber it over the fucking head like a dying horse by taking even the smallest act and blowing it up. I don't think these woke and anti-woke channels understand that to anyone that isn't on the radical end of the tug-of-war they have going on with each other, they're really just doing the same shit to one another. Like, oh, I don't know, claiming that gaming journalists blow things out of proportion, cherry-picking the same few worst gaming journalist sites you always know will say something stupid so that you can proceed to blow things out of proportion. Listen, if I want to go see Ashley treated like a toaster strudel right now, I can just go in and type in Rule 34. Food Truck is blessing us right now as we speak. But I'm not fucking pressed about the fact that I can't take her to a ladder and look up her skirt in the game anymore. Especially when I can head to the model viewer right now and her knockers will be knocking about. I think you guys will be fucking fine. Now back to Dead Space, let's talk about the gameplay improvements. Outside of Isaac having a voice, he also melees and stomps at a similar speed to what he will do in the rest of the trilogy. The ship is now also fully connected, with side rooms and tunnels bridging one deck to the other. So you no longer just hop on a tram and head to your destination in most cases. You often have to go there and unlock the tram system, and from that point on you can go back and forth between decks as you please up until the last chapter of a game, since of course you leave the Ishimura completely. Now when I first heard this, I was like, why the fuck would I even want to do that? Well, that's because of the new clearance system. See, now that the ship is seamlessly connected, the best way to motivate you to go back if you don't have the hard-on for backtracking that some horror fans tend to have to want to explore just to be exploring is the new clearance system. In the original game, when you revisited locations for the latest chapters, a lot of the crates and lockers that were locked before would be unlocked. That entire idea has been expanded here, with the idea that as the game progresses, Isaac's security clearance gets upgraded to about 4 levels, 3 of which are story related and the other 4th one being a side mission. Speaking of which, there are side missions now, which if you're like me, you probably heard and were immediately fucking disgusted about. Because time and time again, we've seen single player games turn into tedious work, like in Gears 5, thanks to this push for them in every game by a lot of these big review sites and channels that I cannot for the life of me understand would be for any other reason than to push the game's runtime to about 1 million fucking hours, otherwise it's not worth full price. And while I could go on another rant about how people who push for this are a tumor on the gaming industry, that's not really the point. The point is that here they're extremely well done. They're wrapped into the narrative as opposed to being something ridiculous like trying to find a damn document for Dr. Kind or something stupid. There's really only about 3, and as you play, their next steps are typically on the way to your next objective, usually off in some side door as you pass by, to where without even really trying, you can comfortably complete at least 70% of every side mission in the game up until about chapter 9 to 10. Where all the decks are unlocked and you might have to do a little more leg work for some of them. Whereas one of the side missions, like I said, is just a master clearance upgrade so that you can unlock the highest level doors. It's cool to go around seeing how all these key personnel that were really just kind of audio logs in the original actually meet their end. Benson, for example, is actually the one repeatedly breaking the tram system you need to repair at the start of the game, he just doesn't realize it. He ends up offing himself with the marker tricking him into jamming it one final time with his own body. But the 2 real ones involve Isaac actually searching for Nicole by retracing her steps in her attempt to stop the outbreak and stop Mercer, and him looking for more information on the Hunter, its origins as Patient Harris, and how Mercer stole him away from Nicole as her patient, and made the Necromorph outbreak 10 times worse. When you do both of these, it all comes together nicely and expands both of their characters, intertwining it all into one giant story. Nicole's mission especially is really well done here. Before, in the original, she was just kind of Isaac's girlfriend he was supposed to be looking for. But he forgets it like 2 chapters into the game and it barely felt like he had one. Here, she is very important, and she feels like the type of person who's a match for Isaac's genius. We'll talk more about this later since I don't want to break too far away from talking about the gameplay loop changes, But yeah, this is probably the best Nicole has ever been as a character. And how Tanya treats both real Nicole and hallucination Nicole as two different personalities is great. What brings this all together is the intensity director I mentioned earlier. This solves a problem that these types of games have always had, and it is an absolute game changer. The game can change how much and what exactly it's throwing at you as you traverse the ship to explore, based on a bit of RNG and other factors like Isaac's heart rate, health, and other things that the game is measuring. Now, it doesn't get carried away and just throw the game balancing tits up, but it does add a sprinkle of replayability. Action horror games like this have always thrived on their New Game Plus and constantly being replayed. And now doing that, there's a little mystery to what you might run into while exploring, which is when it's typically occurring, as most of the main encounters are still based on static enemy placements, as they should be to preserve balance. I'm not sure how many combinations of encounters there can be, as I've beaten this game at least 10 to 15 times now, and every now and then something still catches me off guard, like walking into a room that has been clear every single time I've entered it on previous runs, only for it to be not so clear this next time around. But it's really good shit. That said, it's not exactly perfect. It's a good idea, but there's work to be done if this is a system they want to implement in a Dead Space 4. Which means it's time to talk about some of the cons to this game in general. There aren't a lot, but every game has them. Starting with the intensity director, it can absolutely break and fall apart, and lift up the curtain based on entering and re-entering areas. The enemies tied to the intensity director seem to be, in my experience, tied mostly to the cell on the map they spawned in. So they rarely, if ever, can follow you if you just walk right back out of the room. Oftentimes, legit just turning around and walking away, presumably to go jump in a vent somewhere else and despawn. Thing is, sometimes all it takes is walking right out of the room and the door shutting to make them despawn anyway without vents. Combine that with the player's natural reflex to back away from the thing trying to stab you in the damn mouth, and it doesn't really mix well in smaller rooms. You'll open the door, something will pop out a vent, and then you'll start blasting away and back away, and next thing you know, it turns around because it can't follow you out, and when you go back in to finish it off, it's somehow completely despawned and you'll never see it again. It can really take the stage curtain off and show you what's behind it. Walking in areas like the engineering deck in Chapter 2 back and forth are some of the biggest offenders. Speaking of the AI, it's not the greatest either. I mean, it tries, but again, a lot of your encounters outside of the big memorable rooms are tied to the new intensity director, so they tend to be on a leash, and when they aren't, it can lead to weird behavior with doors and walls like what's happening here. If the AI can't find a vent to climb through because of where it spawned, it'll just hang by the door, and weird shit like this can happen. I've also had this happen where instead of falling through the floor, one actually got shot through the ceiling and got stuck, but was completely free to move around. So it's a little buggy, but they're getting the right idea. Another thing is that the laser sights in this game's aiming mode are now this hybrid between the classic sights that reacted to the world and the lamer centered crosshair from 2 and 3 that you could revert back to the classic in the aim options. When asked why they did this in the Ask Me Anything Reddit event, they said it was because they were building these environments and they felt they became too big for the classic sites. So they did away with them since the team was having trouble aiming with them. And be that as it may, I don't find that a good enough reason not to include them. Dead Space 2 and 3 had switched to the centered aiming for that very exact reason, and still allowed you to switch back. The environments here aren't any bigger than some of the ones in Dead Space 3 specifically. In fact, some of the ones in that game are way more complex than what's going on here, and it played fine. They, without a doubt, still should have had a menu toggle for those who preferred them regardless of how they may be harder to aim with. Later Resident Evil games all did this for this exact reason. Devs don't always have the same skill as players when you release your game into the wild. Something else that could use a bit more refinement is this whole circuit breaker system. Now, to make Isaac feel like more of an engineer, which is how he feels in Dead Space 2 and 3, in this game, breakers have been added where you have to reroute power in between areas and functions of the ship. In Chapter 3, they offer you an interesting choice on whether or not you want to turn off life support and be able to see but not hear Necromorphs coming, or turn off the lights and hear them but not see them. They never really offer this kind of choice ever again, and I think it is an interesting concept that could be explored a lot more. Another thing is technical issues, like this game just abruptly cutting out and going into an infinite load screen. I'm not sure what causes this, but my assumption is that it's VRAM related. Like a lot of the problems that have been plaguing PC gaming as of late. There's no way to get out of this once this happens, and your game is stuck like this. You need to close it and restart, and in addition to that, the game has poor VRAM management on PC in general. It doesn't matter if you're getting 30 FPS or 100 plus FPS. Cutscenes and picking up weapons can flood a shit ton of data into your VRAM and cause your frames to drop pretty badly. It gets worse the longer you play the game into the later chapters, and it seems to be Chapter 12 that's the worst offender of running poorly. The Hive Mind cutscene almost maxes out my 4070 Ti's VRAM, even though it's barely being used. And when the game launched, I don't know why the fuck they did not do this, but you still cannot swap between previous suits you unlocked. That came in a patch later. The fact that this isn't one of the no-brainer changes for them is baffling, because this is a beloved feature from Dead Space 2 and 3. I am a huge advocate for being able to reverse armor upgrades in games that you feel are starting to look a bit out of control when it comes to blingage. Especially this time around, because the remake suits are all beautiful. And when the game launched, those previous looks and designs that artists spent all this time detailing and crafting went to waste the minute you upgraded your suit. They're all improved over the original designs, and now all share the same helmet frame and silhouette, so they actually look like upgraded variations of a base suit a company would make, instead of just looking all over the place like they used to. Like I said, it was fixed, but I thought I'd mention it as it was definitely a launch fumble. One final thing I'll mention is that personally, I'm not a fan of some of the new animation work. Isaac has been brought up to his Dead Space 2 mobility, and arguably beyond, but some of his animations feel a bit strange, like his running animation, his 0G thruster animations, and especially his stomp. Some enemy attacks like the grabs and their lunging attack also have this weird, hard to describe, stretchy, bouncy, cartoony feel to them. I'm probably wrong on this assumption since I didn't work on the games, but these feel more handmade than the previous games. That's it, really, as far as negatives go. And if you're not a fucking baby, this really is all minor stuff that doesn't really get in the way of how good the general gameplay loop is. It all comes together nicely with quality of life changes for some balance reasons, like power node doors being axed, as well as all the wasted slots in your weapon upgrade paths being completely done away, and other things to make it flow smoother with the rest of the trilogy, like Isaac being able to reload while he moves, to create this easy to digest dish that allows you to go from Dead Space 1 to 2 to 3 without any sort of jarring transitions outside of the remake obviously having better graphics and, Dead Space 3's weapon system, but I've already made a whole video on that. Now let's talk about the weapons. Unlike the previous games, now you can carry every single weapon in the games should you so choose. They're not bought anymore either, they're picked up in the world as Isaac builds or finds them, with very nice animations so that you can try them all out. Find out what guns you do or don't like, and the ones you want to put in storage or keep. Or you can say fuck it and keep them all and just be armed to the teeth. The trade-off being every single weapon now takes up an inventory slot. So if you want to carry them all, you do lose a decent chunk of space for ammo. On the flip side, if you do choose to carry them all, you'll likely always have some kind of ammo and the most optimal tool for whatever job you need. All our trusty favorites are still here, like the workhorse plasma cutter. The pulse rifle, for example, has lost the spin to win in exchange for the grenade launcher from the latter games. The grenades also now function as mines. The flamethrower has gone from week-old room temperature cheese tier to one of the most godlike weapons in the game. Its secondary fire is now a wall of fire most basic Necromorphs can't really pass through. This is also a Guardian Destroyer. The new force gun seems a lot weaker without upgrades, but for some reason its ammo is treated like the new contact beam ammo, being scarce and selling for a pretty penny. I assume this is because it works with the new peeling system, where as you would assume from the graphical upgrades of the game, Necromorph flesh will get damaged and become easier to shoot off the more damage it takes. And the force gun can peel their whole body down to the bone in about 2 or 3 shots. But I still don't think that warrants the damage nerf. Speaking of the contact beam, it's actually not useless in general encounters anymore. The slow ass charge up has been moved to the secondary fire, and its primary fire is now actually a beam of energy. Crazy, I know, making the weapon with beam in the name actually fire a fucking beam. But it makes it a lot more versatile, and it can actually throw down a shit ton of damage and crowd control. It's been almost tripled in size though. This thing is massive. The line gun is still just the plasma cutter but larger, but the time mine has been changed to a heated laser wire that just shreds anything they come into contact with. I found myself missing the time mine at first, as my muscle memory always wanted to just freeze a brute and throw one down, but once you adjust to the laser tripwires, which if you think about it are kind of just the idea of the detonator from Dead Space 2, only without being a waste of inventory space, they can actually turn entire rooms into an absolute joke, and are hilariously and beautifully overpowered without care, in the funniest way. Speaking of quote-unquote overpowered, the Ripper returns in all its glory. I've never really been the biggest fan of the gun because while ammo efficient, sometimes Necromorphs can just shrug it off and run right through it to hit you. But its iconic characteristic is that in every Dead Space game, it's basically another trusty workhorse tool like the plasma cutter. Extremely ammo efficient. Something which has Under the Mayo here mentally fucked up.
A lot more ammo. But that brings me to the Ripper. The Ripper, in my opinion, does a lot of damage to the early game experience for a first-time player. I felt it myself, and when I invited a friend over to play the game, I saw it happen to him too. One shot from the Ripper lasts long enough to kill an enemy completely, even 2 enemies, and it keeps them in infinite stun. That's probably the worst part about it. It's a mindless and easy way to pass the majority of combat encounters, and that would be fine if other aspects of it were rebalanced. You can hold so many blades without reloading, and the amount of blades given to you through item drops in combat and exploring is absurd. I think this gun should only hold 1 blade in its capacity, having to reload after every shot, with a very long reload time. Make it something you use in an emergency, not something you just use to bully through 80% of the enemies you see.
Listen, Mayo, Doom Eternal came out 3 years ago. It's a great game, but for fuck's sake, let it go. It's over. It's ended development. Drop it. You are not some goddamn expert on game balance and design just because you want every single game ever made to force people to switch in between weapons every 4 seconds like a goddamn spastic. Not everyone is into being challenged, quote unquote, in that way. Dead Space is balanced around you being able to carry as many or as few weapons as you want. There's a damn achievement for it. Bro, could you imagine if they had released this remake with this dumbass fucking idea of making the Ripper only hold 1 blade, so it forced you to swap to something else afterwards? I'm not even a Ripper enthusiast. I don't even fucking like this gun, but I know plenty of people who have it as one of their favorite guns, and they would be fucking pissed. Also, if we're still entertaining this shit idea, are the capacity upgrades to the gun just supposed to do nothing? This is the shit he doesn't think about whenever he talks about a game's balancing, and why it's so hard to take him seriously. The neurons in his brain refuse to activate unless he's playing something that plays like Doom Eternal. And if it's not that, he fumbles in the dark, unable to even fathom the idea that more than one type of player enjoys video games. Every suggestion this dude ever makes is just an attempt to funnel people into the way he thinks the game should be played, not the way they want to replay. And it results in statements like this. Anyway, the Ripper's sick. If you love the gun in previous games, and you're not a Doom Eternal drug addict suffering from withdrawals, I think you'll like this one too. Alt-fire projectile launch now ricochets, which seems kinda weak at first, but invest some time in upgrades, and it can actually do insane shit to entire rooms of Necromorphs as it bounces around. All of these weapons, as well as stasis, can be upgraded through benches like always, but to unlock more of their potential, as well as a unique stasis upgrade, you'll need to explore the ship and complete the side missions. If you don't want to do any of that and just beeline through the story, they're still strong, so no big deal. Well, what about story changes? This is a golden opportunity to revise some things here to be more in line with the later games as far as the markers, how they work, EarthGov, and unitology. Well, Dead Space Remake mostly plays out identical to the original game for the first quarter, with additional things like looking for Nicole in places like her office and secret rooms where she attempts to understand the outbreak. Isaac also no longer eats the fucking medbay barricade explosion with his face, so that's good. The canon sections in chapters 4 and 8 have also been entirely reworked to suck less, so that's also good. But the end of chapter 4 and the start of chapter 5 specifically is where we start to get interesting. See, instead of Isaac being sent there specifically to make poison to stop the Leviathan, the Kellyan crew pick up a broadcast from Nicole, telling all survivors to gather in the medbay. It's actually just a trick by Mercer to lure people there to experiment on. Some of the hydroponics crew came up to the medbay looking for liquid nitrogen to make a toxin to kill the Leviathan, but Mercer has snatched them up. Mercer's actor does incredible work here. Back in the original, he really suffered in retrospect in comparison to later villains in the series because he had absolutely no fucking clue what he was doing and just seemed pretty stupid. Here, he's still crazy, he's still a religious nutjob, but he's got more drive to him than just making more Necromorphs. His goal has been rewritten to try to trigger and understand convergence, since that's what the markers have told him to do with Harris. The needle machine from Dead Space 2 is even looped into here. He'll later kidnap Jacob Temple and try to use him to force the marker to trigger convergence, and nothing will work because he has no clue what he's doing. Harris is Nicole's violent patient she was making progress with rehabilitating before he poached him off of her. Mercer obviously having made Harris into the Hunter. Mercer unleashes the Hunter onto Isaac, and from here on out they'll both be the biggest threats to Isaac's journey, just like old times. I really enjoy the back and forth between Isaac and Mercer that's been added. Again, Isaac hasn't been rewritten here. He talks to him the same way he would talk to any other major villain.
But you and Dr. Brennan have delayed me enough.
If you've heard Nicole,
I have never shown you anything but courtesy to Dr. Brennan. Can you say the same?
I can say I'm not a fucking murderer.
And it feels like the Isaac Clarke we know from 2 and 3 retrofitted into Dead Space 1's story. It's actually one of the crew from Hydroponics, barely alive, that lets Isaac know that the air is going bad and they're all about to suffocate unless he can get the supplies to Hydroponics. So that's what he does. When he gets there, he runs into Cross, who's trying to make an enzyme to kill the Leviathan. But to do that, we'll have to weaken it by killing off all the weakers like the original. Only this time, the level has been both expanded and simplified at the same time. Simplified as in you don't go left, do a thing, and then come back right, and then do the exact same thing in the exact same layout, flipped anymore. The right side is actually blocked off, but the left is expanded here, where it loops around and encompasses the whole level now. Cross is also actually given a character beyond just simply being scared in all of her audio logs like she was in the original. She has a way bigger role in the game this time around. She also has some nice lips. I'm just saying, I see what Jacob's driving at here, you dig? She's also really bothered by what's happened to her crew and leaves a message telling anyone trying to get into hydroponics to turn back, replacing Hammond, who would usually be here. Though I can't help but find it funny that Isaac doesn't take his helmet off, yet Hammond has a line where he tells him not to take it off in the original, but he isn't here in the remake, where that line would actually make sense. Once we do our usual thing and kill the Leviathan, who's been adjusted to accommodate zero-G movement, completely sidestepping the issue of his weird hitbox in the original, we have a talk with Cross, who tells us about the SOS beacon in Chapter 7, and that she hasn't heard back from Jakin, who at this point has been kidnapped by Mercer, and then we're on our way to the mining deck. Biggest change in this chapter is Isaac meeting Nicole face to face again. It has been rewritten even better than I expected. I always assumed that the door Isaac needed to have unlocked in the OG was never actually locked in the first place and he was just tripping. But in New Game Plus, you can actually find an audio surveillance log of what happened in this room. Isaac is out of his mind by this point and seeing Cross as Nicole. Outside of that, what I wanted them to do here is exactly what is done. Isaac tells Kendra he's seen Nicole and she's helped him, and Kendra is unnerved because she's looked up Nicole's rig by this point and knows that she's dead. But what doesn't want to tell Isaac that, and is just playing along with him. Only other two changes worth talking about is Isaac, through doing Nicole's side missions, can find the opening video log between him and Nicole in Dead Space 2 as an audio log in the form of an Easter egg in this game. I'm pretty sure Gunnar and Tanya re-recorded these lines. That, and instead of the Hunter making a cameo in this chapter in the form of the elevator, he actually surprises both new and returning players by showing up once we eject the SOS beacon out into space and chases us out of the level. I was pleasantly surprised by this. They gave him a little more screen time without changing him into an annoying fucking pursuing enemy chasing you around the whole levels like Resident Evil likely would have done. And I 100% still commend them for that. Chapter 8 plays out almost identical with the exceptions of Kendra now almost blowing her cover by confusing Isaac with Hammond and dismissing Isaac's suspicions on why the Valor would even be out here to pick up their signal. And the Slug now being replaced with the Leviathan reattaching itself to the ship. I find this to be a non-issue and not really a cut boss or cut content. Simply a replacement and adjustment. Keep it real without the bullshit. If nobody told you the Slug was not the Leviathan just reattaching itself to the ship in the original game, or you didn't look it up on the wiki, there's a good chance you wouldn't even know it's not the same creature, just mutated. So here, its boss fight is reworked into something that isn't shit. From there, you don't even have to run back to the tram to start Chapter 9. The Valor smashes into the Ishimura close to where this boss fight ends. Hammond getting into the ship is actually explained this time around as he just grabs an EVA suit. The radioactive material room has been removed, and in its place we have something more reworked into the narrative, giving us this absolute gem of a line.
Isaac, we have a problem. The Valor's carrying a 12 megaton warhead. The crash hit the torpedo bay hard. I need you to handle that nuke right away, before something sets it off.
Handle 12 megatons? You know I'm not a nuclear engineer, right?
I don't need you to be. Just stabilize the warhead and eject it away from the Ishimura.
Christ, Hammond.
No one trained you to carve up monsters with a plasma cutter either. You haven't let us down yet.
Isaac and Hammond call bullshit on the Valor being here on patrol because why bring a nuke for that? And Hammond finds logs of the Valor's plan to recover the marker and kill all the survivors. This breaks something in his sanity and he starts going crazy. Quick side note, but the Twitchers seem way tankier this time around. I mean, it makes sense, they are wearing military armor after all, but shit man, these things take a beating now. They also leave you a shock and a little treat if you're used to the old shooting range minigame from the original. Eventually, Isaac makes it to the Singularity Core, only this time, Hammond meets a different end. Up until this point, the game has made a big deal about how much Hammond cares about his crew. He's a commander. He's responsible for them. And chain of command means that as long as they follow his orders, he is responsible for ensuring their safety. In the original, I didn't even remember their names, because they were no-name grunts who die in the first 5 minutes or so. Here, I can tell you who Haley and Chen are. Big improvements, as while both of them have served with Hammond before, Isaac and Kendra are actually new to Hammond, and that's who he's stuck with now. The idea that Hammond was played by people way above his pay grade, lost close comrades he served with before, and finding the logs that confirmed he and his crew were basically sent out here to be expendable in a politics war finally mentally breaks him. Instead of the slasher Hammond puts in the escape pod in the original just being a random one, it's Chen who's been following him around. He's completely broken by the time we see him in the Singularity Core room, and if you look closely, he actually locks himself in and calls it a malfunction. Unable to even tell he's not on the Ishimura anymore. Chen shows up and Hammond sees him as human and it gets him pretty good. He then pushes himself and Chen into the Singularity Core, starting the Valor having a meltdown. I really like this change, as his original death, like I pointed out in my retrospective, was kinda pointless for him. It just made him look incompetent. He sacrifices himself and tells Isaac to run, only Isaac has nowhere to go and still has to fight what killed him anyway. We make a break for it as usual, and Chapter 10 is where this remake really stretches his legs and improves over the original. When Isaac runs into Mercer this time, he only has Temple. Elizabeth isn't here. Jacob tries to kill him and escape, but Mercer freezes him in stasis and executes him, pissing off Isaac. And then, in what might be my favorite moment in Dead Space, Isaac beats on the glass, and the Hunter answers by beating on the glass himself and breaking through like Brock Lesnar. The one downside to how fantastic this moment is that it's not really clear how to get out of this situation. My first playthrough of this, it took me a good minute or so and a lot of ammo wasted to see the tendril you need to shoot tucked away in a corner to escape the room, which takes you to the mess hall that Mercer killed Cross and Temple in the OG. It's about here where Isaac starts to go completely batshit. See, in that room he just left, Isaac made full contact with the marker. The unitologists have moved it from the cargo bay here to the crew deck to worship it, and for Mercer to try to make it start convergence. This is a huge problem for Isaac because he just fought the Hunter next to it and is basically gone insane, flying in autopilot for a large portion of this chapter. Not even the objectives on his HUD make sense. As an Easter egg, they spell out "turn it off" if I'm correct, and reference the Brother Moons of Dead Space 3, to the point where I honestly had no idea what he was even doing. It just seems like he was running around just doing shit. But he's actually supposed to be shooting away 4 tendrils blocking his way into the room where the escape shuttle is, which will make up most of the chapter. The highlight moment of this chapter, without a doubt, is completing the last of Nicole's side mission. Nicole, like I mentioned, is both a doctor and a therapist, and she has a habit of helping ex-unis leave the religion. That's how she met Isaac. His mother was a unitologist, and she was treating her. For a while, everything was fine, but Isaac, as you know, pushed for Nicole to take the Ishimura job before it was decommissioned. With Nicole gone, unable to support his mother, she snapped due to unitologist pressure and killed his father and herself. And the Church of Unitology stole their bodies away, so Isaac couldn't bury them properly. The last conversation between him and Nicole was him calling her to tell her what happened, and that it was her fault, which really hurt her. But what's really, really important here is I want you to pay attention to Isaac's reaction to her hanging up. Because it's not actually his reaction to her hanging up. That is his reaction to seeing her final farewell message. It's just merged into his hallucination. Pay attention to how he rushes to turn off the computer before he can see her do what she's going to do.
You know what? Go to hell, Isaac.
Nicole! 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 I didn't. Oh God, no. Not her too.
And he says not her too. And pay attention to the fact that her final farewell plays just when he turns the camera off. And what he says afterwards is, "I didn't lose her." He knew what she did before he even got here. He just showed up anyway in denial, thinking that he can change something if he just doesn't watch the whole tape. Now, he didn't know about the outbreak or anything like that because she never mentioned it. But because he didn't watch the whole tape, it looked to him like she did what she did because he made her feel guilty about his mother and ignored all her attempts to contact him again. Remember, in Nicole's message, this time when she pulls out the needle, she says, "I can't return what was taken." Isaac, on first viewing this, thinks she's talking about his mother, but she's actually talking about the marker. That's why he volunteered when he found out that Ishimura had sent an SOS. That was his opportunity to get here. What they have done with Isaac and Nicole here, and the depth their relationship and struggle has been fleshed out to, is so good I don't think I can convey it through words in English. When Isaac reaches the final tendril, he runs into Kine, as per usual, who explains what's at stake, the hive mind, and everything with the original. Here, if you look through his notes, you get a somewhat explanation for the whole hive mind controls the markers thing that was retconned in 2 and 3. As I understand it, and honestly it's still a little confusing, a bit of a mess you just have to gloss over no matter how they try to explain it, the hive mind is a being created by the markers and those that made them, but unlike the other organisms that the marker makes, it's inherited the ability to control the rest, just like the markers themselves and the brother moons. It's become intelligent. But it's become too intelligent and too self-aware in the marker's absence, after it was pulled from Aegis 7. And it wants to do its own thing, free of the marker's control, to get the hive mind back in check. This is why I assume the Necromorphs still attack you all throughout Chapter 12, even though realistically they shouldn't be, if the marker ever wants to actually be moved back to where it was. Because those aren't Necromorphs controlled by the marker on Aegis 7, but the hive mind. Everything continues as normal up until we kill the hunter, who Isaac has different dialogue for, depending on if you did his side mission or not. For this playthrough, I really didn't bother with it. This time, Mercer actually reacts to you killing his greatest creation, and the drag tentacle shows up, and gives him that convergence he's been looking for by crushing him to death and dragging you away too. I think Mercer's new end works story-wise, but it could have been a bit more clear. It's better than his old one, where he both didn't seem to give a shit about his hunter dying, and just kinda letting an infector kill him and turn him into any other necromorph. But here, he ironically gets what he asked for, just not in the way he was expecting. I should also mention that they actually explain why the hunter won't just kill him, because he's got a stasis device that shocks him and subdues him whenever he tries. I just think it could have been a bit more obvious he dies here, because he gets pulled away so quickly it's hard to tell, and his rig doesn't beep, so it wouldn't surprise me if a lot of players didn't even know that he was dead and just thought he got dragged away. From here, we're back to the OG story track, with a few upgrades like Nicole and Isaac having a talk where he apologizes for what he did and said. Other than that, everything plays out mostly identical up until the main reveal. Once Isaac puts the marker on the pedestal and Kendra makes him watch the tape, some new dialogue is added about how she tried to stop this, but it's still mostly the same, right down to the music, until something crazy happens. They twist the twist, from Isaac seeing a Nicole that was never there, to Isaac seeing Cross as Nicole, and Cross having seen Isaac as Jacob. I didn't expect that, but it does make sense in that Nicole reads some screens that helps Isaac bring the marker this time around, and to help make players believe that she's still alive, because she has a physical presence in the world. From there, we race back to the shuttle. Kendra still gets Rule 34'd by the hive mind, though honestly he let her off quite easy this time. And Isaac fights it. It has a new attack that's just acid spitting to cut the arena off and make it smaller, but it's still the same otherwise. The part where it grabs you has been moved from the middle of the fight to the grand finish, and you now only have to shoot one final weak spot instead of its last 3 top eyes, which was honestly kind of fucked up before, so that's a fair change. He books it out of there, and Nicole still grabs him at the end. In New Game Plus mode, you can find marker fragments scattered around the chapters. If you collect them all, from chapter 11 onwards, Isaac will have a different dialogue showing how crazy he's become. I can't imagine any of this dialogue is actually canon, but the ending of the game will also have a new cutscene where Isaac has covered the escape shuttle and marker symbols and gone crazy. This alone could be canon, as there's no reason it can't take place sometime after the normal cutscene. The remake is beautiful. I always knew I had nothing to worry about when it came to this one, because the developers were clear as day and constantly kept the community updated with their ideas and what they were doing. You could tell from the jump that Dead Space 2 was the new baseline they were trying to bring the original up to. But Dead Space 2 was just the better game. It was the breakout hit for this franchise. That's good. That's what sequels are usually trying to do, improve on just about everything. But I could never relate to those who thought Dead Space 1 was better just because it was quote-unquote scarier, when Dead Space 2 eclipsed it in every other way, even in popularity and sales. Here, enough of Dead Space 2's improvements have been retrofitted to where I can actually see an argument for this being better than Dead Space 2 now. I still think Dead Space 2 is the better game. I'm an action horror man. And Dead Space 2 is the perfect blend of cool, grand, explosive shit going on, great gameplay, better characters than the original, and has barely aged a day outside of visuals. Which even then I'd argue hold up a lot better than, say, the PS1 era held up during the PS3's reign, as everything it does is still being done as we speak in games. But I can totally see now an actual argument for Dead Space 1 Remake being a better game, even if it's just barely. And not for some dumbass reason like it being less linear, but for solid reasons that actually mean something, like improved gunplay. Having the same impale system from 2, but with more objects in the environment. The peel system not only being a visual mechanic, but an actual combat mechanic. And an improved story over the original version of the first game that can actually compete with Dead Space 2, thanks to Isaac having a voice and reducing all the plot holes and whatnot. Resident Evil 4 here is a different story. Because Resident Evil is a bigger franchise with a bigger fan base, and with that inevitably comes infighting and divisiveness between entries, and different eras and formulas. Add to that, Capcom has one of the worst, most wishy-washy, inconsistent fan bases on the planet, with some of the dumbest fucking unthought-out statements you could ever read. So my question became, who was this made for? Is it made for fans of the action horror era that is statistically the most popular one, spanning the most games, the most canonical movies, and the most sales? Or is this going to be a watered down version to appease those fucking weird ass roaches living under the sewer that say shit like, the series lost its way when 4 came out, and live in some fucking bubble where they play Resident Evil 1 to Code Veronica on their favorite emulator and just live in that echo chamber? What will they change? What will they ruin to appease people they shouldn't be trying to appease? This is their magnum opus. This is their baby. You can put it on anything, any platform, and it is a hit, regardless of its detractors. People, statistically, love this game more than just about any other entry. The original game made games that were releasing later the same year completely overhaul their gameplay to be like it. It has become the absolute baseline every single third-person shooter must present itself as for 3 console generations in a row now. Hell, Capcom themselves only made it one game trying to quote-unquote return to their roots in 7 before they gave up and just decided to make it like Resident Evil 4. And they couldn't even make it through that game's DLC without doing it. So you bet your fucking ass I was worried for this remake when I found out they were doing one. Because I know who the most popular channels known for discussing Resident Evil games tend to be. And I know Capcom is likely listening to them and looking at them for Americanized feedback. Hell, one of them is a fucking Capcom partner. And you know how gatekeepy as fuck they can be when it comes to this franchise. Action bad, horror good. Never mind that it's been 22 fucking years since their fixed camera angles and shit got taken out back and put down. If it isn't obvious to you, I clearly grew up getting into the series with 4, but I do still enjoy the classic Resident Evil games. I don't think they've aged all too well. I think you'd have to be smoking dicks to think you can just sit a modern gamer with no experience with the franchise in front of a copy of one of them and expect them to enjoy it without having a difficult time adjusting. And the fact that even though Resident Evil 1's remake is great, we still have people begging for Capcom to remake it again to be more like the remakes of 2 and 3 instead is a prime example of that. But I think that they can still be enjoyed as they are if you temper your expectations a bit. They are charming and they can be solid even if you didn't grow up with them. But hold them to a standard you would hold an indie title today or something. But Resident Evil 4 is a different beast. Because gaming has not evolved much past what it started. Not even in the same series, and it's been damn near 18 years. To the point where all you have to do is slap a modern control scheme from one of the later games on the original Resident Evil 4, and just like that, you have a modern game. With the only thing that is still a limitation of its time being that you can't move and shoot. Something that has completely confused Jared from Avalanche Reviews here.
There was one black cloud hanging over the experience. The default control setup was really weird and didn't make any sense at all to me. For some reason, it has you using R2 to fire your weapon when every game so far has used the old aim with R1 and fire with the action button approach. And yes, I was able to change it to something a little more familiar, but I kind of wonder why they'd go in and make the default configuration for this port be so wildly different from the original release. I mean, you gotta figure people playing this version would be looking to play it the same way they did the original, but hell, for all I know, this might be some sort of really efficient speedrunner approved control setup. You guys tell me.
No, Jared, what the fuck, dude? I'm sorry, but it is just so easy to beat up on classic Resident Evil pushers and fanatics because they are completely oblivious to the reason that they lost the war over what Resident Evil should be. They don't know how to adapt or accommodate modern younger generations. Hell, something as simple as even offering a modernized control scheme for the original Resident Evil for newer players to get adjusted to and make it easier for them to want to experience the original sent them into a fucking frenzy. Jared, that thing you do where you go out of your way to avoid HD ports of things and track down original hardware, original control schemes and whatnot to experience the game how it was originally released, that's cool and all. I respect that grind, but you cannot expect that out of a modern gamer that already thinks this game is old as shit in the first place. There will be outliers for that type of thing, sure. But don't you want to experience it as it originally came out is the fucking type of thing I would expect my grandpa to ask me. We're talking about an entire generation of gamers today that have grown up with a universal control scheme that they're going to be expecting when they load up Resident Evil 4 to try it. The same control scheme that's in every Resident Evil game after 4. And damn near every other third-person shooter ever made. That is why Capcom updated the controls. That's why the PC HD version has the controls. All the PS4, Xbox One, and Switch ports of Resident Evil 4 did was swap that control scheme by default. Since the data showed Capcom, most people were swapping that control scheme anyway when they released the game on Steam. Now, I like classic Resident Evil, but classic survival horror fans actively fight against themselves when trying to get younger gamers into the games they want them to try. Again, like how in the remastered ports of Resident Evil 1 and Resident Evil 0, they will say everything they can to try to convince you not to use the modern controls or modern aspect ratio to funnel you into playing the way they want you to play. Resident Evil 4 came out when I was 8. I'm about to be 27. I don't even play with the same controls I played with on the GameCube. I switched that shit to modern the second the Steam port came out and never looked back. When the game got ported to PS4, of course I bought it there again. It's Resident Evil 4. My biggest concern was that they weren't going to port the controls over and were just going to port over the PS3 version that didn't have it. And I was pleasantly surprised to find out that the control schemes had been modernized by default. I say this to say, we need to learn to be happy that the games we loved growing up can just have their control swapped to a modern one in the options, and the games are still good enough that that's all it takes to make a younger gamer interested. Because this younger gamer in question could have just not played it and skipped to a more modern entry altogether. I know people right now that couldn't give less of a fuck about what the remakes of 2 and 3 cut or changed in comparison to the PS1 originals, because they are not going out of their way to emulate or play them, because they just don't like what the old gameplay is like. They don't like how the old games look. It is what it is. You can scream into the void all you want, but the internet echo chamber is not always the mentality of the average gamer that isn't browsing forums or comment sections, or even watching these type of review videos. They're just living life, buying the games that they like and are interested in. So yeah, it was pretty hard to sell me on this remake because everyone is everywhere about what a Resident Evil game should or shouldn't have, but one thing is proven, and that is that Resident Evil 4 is the most popular, beloved one. And while I think both the remakes of 2 and 3 were great, they were brought up to modern standards, Resident Evil 4 is still the modern standard. So how do you improve what has aged as good as Jennifer Lopez, Eva Mendes? Easy answer. You leave it the fuck alone mostly. And that's actually what they've done here. Sure, they may have put some different makeup on it, given some new earrings, a new outfit, but they're not fucking with the formula after listening to so many goddamn Neanderthals like I thought they would. For this comparison between the remake and the original, I will be using footage from the PS4 version of the original game. I know there's a PC HD project mod, but not only is that a worthless comparison for console players that make up the majority of the market, but it also doesn't help my case to tell you the original is still aging fine and then slapping some super mega ultra beauty mod on it to present it to you differently than what the average gamer will buy it as. And that's not to diss the mod. I damn sure use it whenever I play Resident Evil 4 in general for the most part now. It's a phenomenal mod. But I want to be transparent in the differences you're getting and not try to dress up these textures and tell you they don't look like shit today, because they do. It's a PS2 GameCube era game. It is what it is. Unlike with the Dead Space remake, which was mostly faithful up to a certain point, even in level layout, Resident Evil 4 Remake takes some liberties right from the jump. One thing you'll notice right away is how much more cold and brooding Leon is here. I'm sure you've heard a million different channels talk about how Resident Evil 4 OG, he's basically a cheesy action movie hero. But I imagine this was a jarring change to people who were coming off his appearance in the original Resident Evil 2. For me, this was my first Resident Evil game, and the one I was introduced to Leon with. But yes, I can acknowledge how odd it is. Here, it feels like he's the same guy from Resident Evil 2, but colder and more grown up. He's seen some shit, it's affected him, and he's edgier, and that's how I like my protagonist. You really get the sense that he doesn't want to be here. Funny enough, this isn't too far off from what he was like in the betas for the original Resident Evil 4.
Where's everyone going? Bingo? Where's everyone going? Bingo?
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
His voice acting delivery was changed to have more enthusiasm, but it's hard to critique it as being a shocking and unfaithful change when it was technically the initial vision for him in this version of Resident Evil 4 that was released to the presses. Also, unlike the original, what he's been up to since Raccoon City is a bit more written out thanks to additional games, spin-offs, and retellings that have come out since this game. He didn't want to be an agent. That is something that was forced on him. And you get a real feel for the fact that this situation he's in now isn't his first rodeo as an agent. He's been on hella missions since then. Whereas the original kind of just glosses over any of that. But be that as it may, I need to give some special props to Leon's voice actor in the RE Engine era. I'm not even going to pretend I know how to pronounce his last name, but Nick does a great job here. I had some issues with his performance in Resident Evil Infinite Darkness, not because he did a bad job or anything, but because he was basically still using his Resident Evil 2 Leon voice in that film. I say film because fuck what Capcom is talking about. That show is clearly a film they just chopped up into pieces for Netflix. But I don't think using the same RE2 voice fit with that version of Leon, because remember, Infinite Darkness is set after Resident Evil 4. But I think even Nick realized this, and so he went with a darker, deeper voice this time around in respect to the original actor's work. And this has presented him a unique opportunity to really become the voice of the character for an era. Something I really only ever seen happen to this scale with Roger Craig Smith and Chris Redfield. To the point where even when Roger does other roles like Batman, I just hear Chris Redfield in a batsuit. And don't get me wrong, Paul Mercer had a good run as Leon too, but his work portraying him in the mainline series was basically one game and one movie, with his work as RE2 Leon in Darkside Chronicles being a spin-off that not many mainstream fans played. But you can tell here, Nick has a real passion and respect for the role he's voicing, as my favorite Resident Evil character in the franchise, and the most popular one in the fan base by far. So it's a huge amount of pressure he's under to get it right. Respect to the guy. The opening is also a lot darker, as you arrive just before daybreak, so it's still dark out. Not too sure about this whole it starts as night, but then 5 minutes after a character walks in and out of a house it turns to day thing that they've been doing lately with Resident Evil, because Village was the same way. Instead of Leon committing a fucking crime by walking into someone's house with his gun drawn out and then acting like the victim when they and everyone else in the village rightfully defend themselves from an armed intruder, the villager actually gives him a reason to kick the shit out of him, as he kills one of Leon's police escorts. The game also introduces its new weaker Plagas form for your first real encounter with an enemy to add to the spook factor. This form is not really easily hit stun like the basic Ganado you're used to, and can do a shit ton of damage if they grab you, so your best bet is to deal with them quickly while you can. From there, everything mostly plays out like it would in the original. Hunnigan is introduced, Leon enters the main village, and it's here I like to talk about the general gameplay similarities and changes. Because at its core, this is still an action horror era Resident Evil game, which means optimal ammo saving play is to stun the enemy and go for a melee attack. One of my biggest, and I mean biggest fears, was that this gameplay loop would be cut and butchered, because having a protagonist that fights back and doesn't crumble to his knees with his head in his hands in the face of danger like a little bitch isn't quote-unquote horror, so it bothers the kind of people never invited to parties for being a buzzkill. But no, it's still here, and it's actually really strong. You can clip an enemy you weren't even targeting with it, and oftentimes kill them in addition to whoever you hit, at least in the early game. And yes, the suplex is back, and from everything I've tested, this is an instant kill. The trade-off is A, it doesn't pop heads anymore. No big deal, since again, it's a one-shotter. And B, it works like it does for Josh and Jake in Resident Evil 5 and 6, where you have to be behind the enemy, and more so like RE5's case, on their knees to do it. I will say, though, that after watching Boulder Punch's review, I do agree that the melee stun is way less consistent than in the original. Sometimes you're in the zone, laser focused, and you pop someone in the face or in the legs, and everyone around him is just lined up for the perfect crowd control melee attack. So you run forward after landing the shot and he just doesn't stun, so you run face first into a crowd of angry ass people, like a moron. This issue is made even worse by the fact that enemies mostly still react to being hit, and you can end up mistaking them touching their face or something for the stun and misread the reaction. But honestly, coming off of how fucking awful enemy reactions were in 7 and 8, I'll take whatever the fuck I can get that's better than that bullshit. In addition, the crafting system that didn't really start with Revelations 2, but has only really been consistently included in every RE game since then, is back here. This means that the ammo counts are lower this time around. Not old school survival horror low, or Resident Evil 7 low, but low enough to where you'll definitely feel inclined to swap around weapons you're using back and forth in encounters in real time as your supplies start to deplete. Especially in Act 1, as if you try to mainstay the pistol and nothing else, excluding the crafting mechanic, and even with the default weapon case that ups your pistol ammo find rate, a couple of encounters can take you from 150 bullets in reserve down to the 60s depending on what you were up against. Speaking of the attaché case, it's back in all its glory. Only this time around there are different ones you can equip. Some of them DLC, some of them can be bought off the merchant. They give different effects like finding more red herbs or resources and gunpowder. Though thanks to the crafting system, this creates one issue, and that's your crafting resources taking up a shit ton of your case space. You can now send stuff to storage so that it's not really clogging up your inventory without you having to sell shit, like in 7, but it's only select stuff like first aid spray and weapons. Herbs, ammo, and stuff can't really be sent over, so this leads to situations, especially later in the game, where you're saving up resources to craft ammo for your stronger guns that you could if you just had a bit more gunpowder or something. And you can't pick up a spray or something thanks to all the damn resources in your case. Can be very inconvenient. Can I just mention how good the new save theme is, by the way? Whoever composed it did a great job. The other thing that can be a bit of a space hog is the new bolt thrower. There's not a lot of new weapons, as most of them are just the same old faithfuls reimagined, with a couple of bonus weapons, and a couple of ones brought over from RE2 and RE3 remakes. But the bolt thrower is especially guilty of space. It's a reimagined mine thrower that shoots arrows instead, so you can give all those fucking annoying arrow shooters a taste of their own medicine, with the alt fire mode being the classic mines you can attach to the arrows. As long as you don't miss and shoot the damn thing out into Africa, we haven't remade that one yet, you can retrieve the arrows from whatever you hit, as long as they don't break and you don't attach a mine to it. Making this a key ammo saving tool that I slept on at first, but I recommend that you don't. Good shit, right? But the arrows take up a load of space. The mines take up a load of space. Hell, the knives you pick up around the world to make arrows take up a load of space. And it's like, fuck man, I need all this, but please be a little more forgiving with what I can put up in the storage. And about knives, they are important, crucial to your survival. Without any sort of knife, you are vulnerable, so get to know it pretty well. It can do exactly what it used to do in the OG, but better. It can break grabs quicker, which will be very important because getting grabbed in this game hurts a hell of a lot. It can also finish off downed opponents, or do massive damage to a boss, but can also, most importantly, parry. You can parry a lot of attacks in this game, if you know what to look for, and it's beautiful. Completely opening up most fodder enemies to a stun attack. Dude, I haven't had this much fun playing Resident Evil games since Resident Evil 6. It feels so good to be back, to have counterattacks back. I thought Resident Evil old heads had fucking robbed me for the rest of this series' lifespan, and that I'd never see them or anything like them again, but here they are, reimagined, fused with the defensive mechanics introduced in the recent remakes. I still think the counters from 6 are cooler, but fuck it man, I'll take whatever I can get at this point. I thought after Revelations 2 we were cursed to just forever have awful bullet spongy stiff combat, and while admittedly Leon isn't as quick and snappy as he is in the original, I wouldn't exactly call him slow like I've seen some people call him now. More like he's heavier. If you pull his knife out, he needs a split second to swap back to his weapon. He needs a second to swap weapons in general now. Some time to go from full sprint to a stop. Some people call this a downgrade, and I mean sure, but Resident Evil's feel and responsiveness has been downgraded in general, ever since like 2017. Thank the fucking old heads for that. He feels about as responsive here as in Resident Evil 2 and 3 remakes. Trust me, we can do a lot worse as far as clunkiness goes. Resident Evil 7 is a game that exists. And while it's a good game, if you've ever played any of the games that came after it or before it, including its direct sequel, trying to go back to that game where Ethan moves like he's 400 fucking pounds while Jack Baker is right on your ass is much, much worse. I've helped old ladies carry heavy bags to their car at work that move faster than Ethan in that game. In combat mode, he kinda does a little duck when you start running that can avoid things similar to pressing the dodge command without moving in 6. So I'll take it, as I thought we'd never get that back period either. Your bread and butter main knife here, at least on your first playthrough, is your combat knife. This is the one to take care of and always repair at the merchant. Anything you need it to do, it can do. Just don't start asking it to do wild shit like parry chainsaws until you upgrade its durability a bit. Then there are smaller knives you pick up in the world, like the kitchen knives and whatnot, that can be used if the other one breaks, or make some bolts for the bolt thrower, but their durability is ass as a trade-off. There's also a new stealth mechanic, but it's done with taste. It's an option you can use if you enter some areas, and not a requirement. Thank fuck there's not a single section of this game that requires you to do it. And as a result of that, I was more willing to use it and engage with it on my own terms. Listen, I don't hate stealth, but I do hate forced stealth. I enjoy games like The Last of Us 1 and 2, where for the most part, stealth and balls to the wall combat trade off each other dynamically based on you, what you want to do, and what you're willing to deal with based off of what you pick. But what I hate is forced stealth, where you take away all of my fucking weapons I just worked for to make half of your DLC suck while I slog through something that goes on way too long because quote unquote scary means turning yourself into Five Nights at Freddy's instead of the damn Resident Evil game I paid for an hour. But here, you don't have to deal with any of that. When all of these parts are working together, again, you get a Resident Evil that hasn't felt this good combat-wise since 6. And the good old village holdout is one of the best showcases of that. The layout is damn near exactly how you remember it, with only minor tweaks, but the enemies are far more aggressive and lethal this time around. The original might have seemed crazy when you first played it, but in reality, you have a lot of breathing room to kind of do whatever you want to do. Here, not so much. They are on your ass constantly, and they're everywhere. The game is less about having a solid game plan and more about being able to adapt your game plan on the fly based on what's happening. There's still a choke point or two in this village, but they're much rarer now. The signature chainsaw enemies have also been given an update too, and he's much scarier looking. Whereas before he just kind of looked like a guy with a sack on his head, he's been given a slight makeover, honestly looking more like his RE5 version with the insane eyes, which I always thought was his best design. Here he has a similar look, with the face you can tell is deformed and disfigured, with the eyes bulging out and missing its lids. He's also got some of his resistance to knockback from his later game appearances, but not quite. He can still be randomly knocked down under certain circumstances, whereas his RE5 version is basically a walking tank. Also, like his RE6 counterpart, he can basically do his Berserk mode swipes whenever the fuck he feels like it. Though, we'll usually do it whenever too many enemies are in his way. I like what they've done with him. The old one was scary when I was an 8-year-old kid, but he was a joke once you realized he was only scary if all you had was a pistol because he was a punching bag for any other gun. One thing I'll say I'm not really feeling is this new precision stat that fucks with aiming. For starters, the laser sight is gone for everything but a few pistols, and yeah, it sucks for something like that was a signature part of Resident Evil's identity, even if just as a toggle in the menu in some of the later games has been axed, mostly as not even the Blacktail or the Red 9 use it, but I can deal with that. It is what it is. What's more annoying is what they've gone and done with this weird shit, where when you adjust your aim in any way, your reticle starts to expand. When you stand still, it will narrow, just like in 2 and 3, to grant you better crit chance and less spread to pay some homage to the classic games, but as soon as you adjust your aim to deal with the enemies that are probably fucking moving, your aim starts to reset. Some weapons reset more than others, but this makes weapons like the TMP spray and pray more than they need to. But it absolutely fucking butchers the broken butterfly, dude. Someone needs their fucking ass kicked for this spread. This is Doom 3 shotgun levels of fucked up. This makes it completely worthless in my opinion next to the Killer 7 this time around, as the Killer 7 still has its integrated laser on it, so it hits what the fuck you told it to without compromise. That damage buff on the exclusive upgrade for the broken butterfly doesn't mean much to me when I have to stand still long enough for what I was trying to hit to touch its nose against mine and hope that it didn't move out of where I aimed the crosshair, or just pray to the weapon spread gods that I hit it somewhere. Outside of the inconsistent hit stun and the worse reticle behavior, the only other issue I have is with the dynamite enemies. Dynamite is extremely hard to shoot out of the air in this game compared to the original. I don't know if it's just because of worse, slower aiming or something, but trying to shoot stuff out of the air resulted in failure more times than not. Molotov enemies from Resident Evil 5 have been added, and they have the same issue. The gameplay pros do outweigh the cons by quite a bit though, so I'll take what's been upgraded for what's been downgraded. After this fight, you'll start to notice some changes to the levels and how they've been structured. For starters now, this is a loadless game, like all the other RE Engine games. You'll find much more redesigns of familiar rooms from this point on. One thing this game tends to do is take you to a spot you remember from the original game, but completely reverse the way you enter it. So it only clicks in your head once you're at the other end that you're in a classic room. It's a real treat. In addition, there's a bit more of that Resident Evil classic identity sprinkled in. Let me give an example. Instead of there being like two separate doors in the farm area, with one being one you can't access without Ashley and the other being the intended way to go, there's only one way forward, and there's a giant ass gate in the way. Instead of just walking from point A to point B directly to the door, you need to loop through a new area into the barn that would usually be open but is now blocked off and locked to pick up a gear to place in the mechanism for the door. A little more of that old Resident Evil identity that I will concede wasn't always present in the original is injected back in. But they don't get out of control with it for the most part. And this is coming from me, the guy who, as you will come to find out as I talk more and more about games, fucking hates puzzles because they break up the momentum most of the time and are a giant unnecessary ass roadblock if you get stuck. I don't have this weird boner for them that old school survivor horror fans have. And I've never played a single game that was missing them where I thought to myself, damn, wouldn't this game be better if this door had some dumbass lock on it that could only be open if I get the answer to something right? And just completely couldn't fucking progress if I couldn't figure this out. I put up with them in games they're in because it is what it is. It's part of games and it's part of a lot of Resident Evil games specifically. So I just have to live with them. But if it was up to me, they'd never be in another Resident Evil game ever made ever again. So if I'm telling you the additional puzzles outside of the ones in the original aren't annoying, I mean it. Besides these stupid fucking power puzzles on the island section, those are canceled. The original worked fine and worked once. This shit is sewer water. One thing I was extremely bummed about as I was reading the headlines is that QuickTime events had been removed. I'm reading that and I'm thinking to myself, what the fuck have they done? You know, I'm watching all these people on Twitter, the absolute fucking worst place for gaming takes and opinions on earth, praise this change as I look on in absolute disgust. I say this all the time, but I like QTEs because they allow for you to do cool shit in a cinematic that just wouldn't work in a way where you'd be able to do it in game, and are still used in some of the biggest AAA games today to great effect. And I disagree in just about every way with people who dislike it. But to see them gone from my favorite game sounded so bullshit. But as it turned out, they actually just meant the ones from the cutscenes and the boulder sprints. I cannot express enough how much I breathed a sigh of relief when I walked down the path to go get Lewis, and this evade prompt popped up. I felt like my baby was safe. It hadn't been accosted by these lames. This is the first of the 3 times I knew I had nothing to worry about when it came to this game. Also, unlike Boulder Punch, I'm not too torn up about the QTE deaths being missing as a result of the QTEs being gone. Because let's really think about how likely a player is to see these. The answer is not very. You have to be fucking up quite a bit to even get one of these. There's only 2 button combinations you need to know in both Resident Evil 4 and 5. And even if you press the wrong one, you can quickly correct and press the other. It's not like it is in 5, where if you press the wrong one on higher difficulties, it's an instant death. So yeah, while some of the deaths are cool, that becomes completely irrelevant when you have to be actively trying to see them in most cases. And I imagine it's tedious from a development standpoint to constantly make deaths you have statistics on showing you that you're wasting your time. The game's currency system as well as the merchant have also seen a few changes as well. Starting with the merchant, obviously his voice has been recast. He doesn't sound like the original. And I'm sure that will bother some people, but I think the new actor does a fine job taking on such a beloved role. He puts his own twist on things while respecting the character's identity, something that some of the cast could really learn to do. Oh, just you wait, we'll get to you. But the biggest change here is to spinels. No longer just that shit you sell when you're out of other stuff to sell. Spinels are a special currency, where you buy special stuff you can't buy any other way, like attachments and the laser sight, so you can put it right back where it belongs. The treasure system has also been allowed to breathe a little, as you can mix and match colors for different bonuses now. And the shooting range minigame has also seen a huge shakeup. Instead of being themed around the Ganado, it's themed around pirates this time. You also don't need to go for headshots, just hit the target. The emphasis is less on precision and more on reactions. You're trying to max your score while avoiding the target you're not supposed to. If you have Ashley or Lewis with you at the time, they'll comment on your performance and cheer you on or tell you that you suck. Now, in keeping with most of the recent Resident Evil engine games, there's a model viewer in the menu, which means obviously bottle caps from the last game would be worthless. So instead, what you have are charms. These attach to your attaché case and give you special bonuses like extra healing, more ammo drops, you get the picture. Some are more useful than others, but it's a cool idea. A lot of them are the old bottle caps from the original game, just ported over. But here's the issue. You don't just win the charms. You win tokens that you use to RNG the charms you want in some machine. I cannot express enough how shitty an idea this was. Apparently there's some sort of hidden calculation table the game rolls at the start of each playthrough, so you can't re-roll something you got by re-rolling and save scumming. Now this is a stupid idea, yeah, but I could deal with that if the game didn't slap you in the face on top of that. So there's two types of tokens, silver and gold. Gold tokens have a higher chance of giving you a rarer charm, but it's only a chance. I've beaten this game at least 4 or 5 times now. The amount of times I put gold tokens in only to get a fucking common charm is actually crazy. To make it even worse, you can get duplicates. So have fun getting the common charms you've already got over and over and over and over. And you're thinking, come on, it can't be that bad, at least the duplicates can stack, right? No, they don't. If you get a duplicate of a charm you already have, tough tits, it's useless. What fucking circus monkey designed this system? I don't even care about the bonuses really, I just like to deck out my attaché case with charms of Leon, Ashley, and Ada for the aesthetic. But I got a better chance of Melanie Martinez walking into my house and giving me a personal dance than I do of getting all these fucking charms. Especially because the table resets when you finish and start a new playthrough. Didn't get the last ones you were missing? Too bad, nerd. Try again next game. Fuck this and whoever pitched it. There's also now more side missions and objectives in the game. When I heard about this for the first time, I just rolled my eyes. The blue medallions in the original worked as like a one-time thing. But I wasn't sold on shit like, go here and backtrack to this area to kill this special enemy. And honestly, I'm still not a fan. The best of them are probably the special enemy encounters in this game. Like killing a Super Plagas Knight in the castle. Or an Iron Maiden buffed out of his mind. But the blue medallions have been beaten into the ground. In addition to lame ones, like killing rats. There are some unique, interesting ones, like throwing an egg on a portrait of Salazar's face, or bringing back a special fish or treasure, but I just feel like as the game goes on, these just go on and on and on and on, to the point where I don't feel like doing them. I feel like Dead Space Remake did this concept of side missions a lot better. There's only 3, sure, but that's all there really needed to be. And they're better weaved into the actual narrative taking place, and don't overstay their welcome. Imagine if, instead of all this clutter, one of the side missions was to explore the Mendez backstory, the Salazar backstory, or the Sadler family backstory. 3 unique side missions that each give you a special weapon at the end of it, as a reward for completing it. The reward in question here, as we have it, is just the aforementioned spinels as a currency, with different tasks giving you different amounts. Anyway, the village is probably the most intact and recognizable of the 3 acts actually. We still meet Lewis in the cabin. Mendez still knocks us out cold, only we don't run up and do a giant ass kick anymore. Again, you can say some of the action movie charm of something like Predator has been removed, and you'd be right, but guys, we can't have everything. Yes, it's fun to make fun of Resident Evil cavemen like Avalanche Reviews for being stuck in the past. Yes, we technically won the tug of war for Resident Evil, but we still gotta be willing to make a few concessions and compromises on the tone of the series. So if it means Leon has to get captured in a more grounded way compared to the original, or Ada doesn't have exploding flash grenade spy glasses anymore, I think that's fair. Leon still gets infected, only it's Mendez that does it this time. Leon and Lewis start off on the wrong foot this time around, but it mostly still plays out the same. We battle our way to Mendez's house, grab the emblem key, and get snatched up by him, and still get saved. Only this time it plays out in a way that makes much more sense, because it has never made sense to me that Leon gets choked within an inch of his life in the original, and decides to just walk back into Mendez's room for round 2, in a fight he clearly stood no chance in, like it was going to play out any differently. Just like me, I doubt it was until Separate Ways came out that most players even saw this cutscene or even knew it was in the game, especially in the GameCube release, because why the fuck would you even walk back in here after that? You'll also be pleasantly surprised to know that the dog you save has been moved here to this location. There's a cool shock to veteran players where you get ambushed when you return to the village to try to put the insignia key in this time. And they blow up the bell tower to block you, requiring you to reroute to a house or through the underground. Then we're back on track up until the lake monster fight. This is another section I was worried about because it's like, what are they going to do to fuck up here and appease the hipsters? What moron are they going to listen to for feedback on what doesn't work about this fight? And thankfully, it's almost 100% faithful to its original design, with the only exception being that when you hit something, you don't get knocked out of the boat and have to swim back anymore. I think that's a reasonable change. This right here is where the remake had my attention. I no longer felt like I had much to be worried about as far as anything getting ruined or fucked with. We're good. From here, Leon passes out and wakes up to it storming just as normal, and gets a new look at the Plagas transformation, which is mostly just the original design. Never thought I'd say this, but this is the first time an enemy barely reacting to being shot has worked in the game's favor. In the original, you pop one of these in the face and they do the traditional stun, and it was a pain in the ass because the head's behavior was independent of the body's reactions. So if you went for a kick, it could oftentimes hit you when you ran up, cutting you even after you stunned it with a handgun shot and before you could get your kick in. This time they drop to their knees if enough damage is done, for a quick kick or stab, a much needed change. This time it's not so simple to grab the church key. We're going to need to drive around a bit and find some other key items to release it here. The lake area opens up a bit Resident Evil 5 style, where you can drive around and look for treasures, and even drive back to the house by the lake we found Lewis in. And we can even use the insignia key to find the area from the opening prologue, where we get a nice callback to a moment from Resident Evil 2 Remake.
Reverse down at RPD. Minutes, I repeat.
The hell is going on here?
Speaking of the prologue, something had to have been cut or changed here. Go back and watch the announce trailer and how Ashley is shown running around freely and being chased through the opening location, and how even the box art of the game shows her nowhere near the church. I have a hunch that originally Ashley had a playable prologue to the game when you first loaded it up, similar to how Resident Evil 6 starts, where she may have escaped captivity for a brief moment, and this opening cutscene is repurposed from that, where perhaps she would see this happen and run around in the village before eventually being caught in the house at the start of the game. And that's why there's all these pictures of her and where they took her in that house. But maybe the prologue wasn't done in time or was deemed unnecessary later on after playtesting, so they just used this specific cutscene instead, making it more like Resident Evil 5's opening if anything. But that's just my theory on what happened with these moments that aren't in the final release. I'm curious to know what actually happened with them. Given things like some of the camera angles of certain scenes that are in the game changed from that trailer, I'm sure I'm spot on. It is nice to explore what is actually, from what I understand, Mendez's old childhood home. Later on, a side mission will take you back to his current house, where you and Ashley can explore the attic and learn a bit more about those that came before him. I again am going to wholeheartedly disagree with Boulder Punch here, and say I 100% enjoy how Mendez, out of all the big threats in this game, is handled, and I think he's far better than the original. He's still a man of few words, but what's been added to him presents him better. In the original, if you read his notes, he's actually a well-spoken and articulated man, But in the game, the one sentence he speaks to you in that goofy ass voice gives you the impression he's dumb and a bald meathead. But in the remake, logs you find indicate that this is actually a very intelligent being. The way he speaks to you lets you know that he's actually sane. He's the head of this village for a reason. Continuing as normal through the El Gigante fight, it's mostly faithful. Once this thing dropped to its knees and I got the prompt to climb up on top of it and hack away any remaining reservations that had still been left about Capcom fucking up this remake had been wiped away almost completely. We're really good now. The dog still helps you out in everything. The only thing I will say is that I don't like how it's introduced in the new cutscene. Compared to the original, it doesn't hold a candle to it. This time around, some cultist from the castle just waves his lame magic lantern and wakes it up from sleeping. In the original, everybody in the village was afraid of this thing. They held it behind this door, and the village was getting so desperate to stop Leon, they let out this uncontrollable monster that even Sadler made them keep locked up. And when they let it out, they lose control of it and it kills everyone in the room before turning its attention to Leon. Here, he just walks out and roars a bit. This is one of the most iconic monsters and moments in this game. Just completely watered down. We get Ashley as per usual, and here there's been some changes too. For starters, she doesn't just rush into your arms because you say the president sent you. Last time someone said it, it was Krauser, who's the reason she's in this situation. Leon has to talk her into trusting him, and over the course of the game, their relationship and chemistry strengthens. Her gameplay is also changed. She no longer has a health bar, instead she can take about 2 hits, one to knock her down and another to kill her. She also has lost the wait and follow commands. Instead, she has stay close and stay back. There are also less spots to hide her in now in the game than there were before. She can still be grabbed and carried away, but Leon can now quickly run up and stab whoever has grabbed her without risking shooting her. She still does a little cute excited pose when you hit things like she used to do on this little gondola section here, but she'll do it dynamically in gameplay now. And a lot of the game's later sections that used to screw the player over and become way harder than they needed to be if you didn't know to leave Ashley. Like seriously, the knight armor room was already bullshit. I couldn't imagine actually doing it with Ashley being trapped in there with you. We'll now have Leon tell Ashley to stay and wait. Another needed change to me. Which reminds me, before I forget, yeah, that ride section with the ganado on the gondola has been cut out. Honestly, I'm not torn up about it. I don't miss it like I miss some of the other stuff that's been cut. Being stuck on a car with nowhere to move while you stand there and try to avoid motherfuckers throwing axes at you was a terrible idea, and I 1000% understand why they axed it. They've also axed Sadler being introduced here, which I don't mind. Sadler showed up in the original, explained his whole plan and how he needs the president's daughter and he's doing this to build his own army, control the world, and become an unstoppable war machine, and then turns right around and his minions almost kill her like a bunch of fucking idiots. What good is controlling the world if you basically have to be in the same room with whoever you're controlling to get them to act right? Here, while he isn't present, what this does is actually give his ability to control what's going on and what's happening more significance. He can see and hear through everything and everyone the Plagas has infected, through that staff that he's lugging around. He doesn't even need to leave the island to get shit done anymore. He feels like someone who's actually powerful now. He sends out his commands and it doesn't matter where you are, you obey. He lets the villagers know immediately that Ashley and Leon are getting away and they rush to the church. As opposed to before where they jump out the window on him and walk in front of the church where Sadler could have just walked outside and cut them off. Not having him around much until the island makes him look like less of an incompetent moron and more like a ruler. One thing they axed, or rather toned down, is the rain section. I know I'm probably in the minority on this, and I don't give a fuck, but I actually like the rain obscuring your vision and making it harder to see during this part of the game, as it added to the tension in encounters. It's supposed to be so bad Leon and Ashley can barely see and constantly shield and hold their face, but it just looks like a light drizzle now. And I wouldn't even be able to tell this was a heavy storm if not for the wind effects they added in. It just looks windy. I do agree it could have been adjusted a bit as far as weird things with its direction, but this is supposed to be so bad a helicopter can't land. As it has been retconned from being shot down to basically just being Mike unable to land safely. But we continue to another signature, the cabin fight. It still starts the same, but Leon is ready to strangle Lewis for that shit he pulled before, and being an Umbrella employee. But before you can get any answers out of him, they get swarmed. Interestingly, the boards from Resident Evil 2 Remake are brought over for this. There's a couple on the table, but enemies also tend to drop them when you kill them. The ability to shoot Lewis enough for him to get mad and kill Leon has been completely removed, but again, I'm not really torn up about it. This fight is way harder than the original thanks to the heavier gameplay, and with the changes to the weapon spread, you'd probably hit him more times than you'd like to. Add to that how much more grenades will save your ass here, and I can understand why they did away with it. This is still one of the game's shining moments, but holy fuck, this section can be brutal towards the end. To the point where even the ending to it is different. Instead of them just abruptly backing off, Ashley comes and opens a way out. Lewis's castle conversations and his original conversation here have been combined, and he makes it clear he wants to help you. So he heads off, and for some reason we get a cutscene from separate ways here between him and Ada. This is so weird for them to do, as it would make more sense for this cutscene to be saved for separate ways like it was before. This will happen again in the castle, and I don't understand why. Speaking of Ada, it's time. Let's go ahead and rip the band-aid off and open the floodgates. Her new voice actor is awful. I'm not gonna sugarcoat it, it's bad. Really bad. We're talking PS1 era Resident Evil bad.
The deal was, we get you out of here when you deliver the amber. No amber, no protection, Luis.
I don't think this is what old school fans mean when they say return to the roots of the franchise.
Barry! Where's Barry?
Well, I'm sorry, but he's probably...
She sounds shaky, confused, cold, bored, uninterested, and uninteresting in about every scene she's in. This was a horrible casting. I can't imagine that she's using equipment any different from what other actors are using, and yet she somehow managed to give a performance so poor, it sounds like she's recording from the inside of a bathroom on the cheap microphone I'm using.
Hey, got a smoke?
I do. The kind you like. Now where's the amber?
She's got a few good lines here that aren't awful, one of which is just her yelling for Leon to run, but those are the exceptions and not the rule. She has to be either yelling or talking in an extremely low voice to deliver an acceptable line. Now, yeah, she's been getting harassed about it online, on Instagram, and that's not cool, but what are you gonna do? Tell the people going out and doing it they're being bad people and to stop? They knew that before they did it. They're not gonna stop just because you make a video saying it's mean. I can tell you don't go over there and spam her with hate, but you're gonna do whatever the fuck you want realistically. Because I'm not your fucking dad. Capcom fans have been 50% chill and 50% absolute fucking morons since like 2012. This is the kind of shit they're known for doing, being annoying. This won't be the last time, I can assure you. Once your fan base gets to the point where people start doing weird shit like dedicating their entire Twitter accounts to characters like Jill Valentine and Claire Redfield, living every waking moment of every day, retweeting every picture and post they can find of characters 24/7, 365 days a year and shit, you've reached no man's land. The point of no return. There's officially bad apples in your bunch. There's nothing you can do. That being said, her response to the criticism of her performance is just as shit as the performance itself. This is her official response. And this is one of the most accountability dodging things I've ever fucking read. She blames the negative response to her performance on, of course, white privilege, her being a person of color, and the fact that she simply participated. Basically, every single straw you would expect someone to grasp in the 2020s decade to deflect critiques of her work. Defenses that hold water about as well as a restaurant napkin when you examine what they're saying. Number one, last time I checked, I was a person of color, so I'd love for her explanation on how me not liking her portrayal is routed in my white privilege. Kratos is whiter than Charmin Ultra Soft toilet tissue, and has been voiced by 2 black men over the course of God of War's history. Do you know why no one made a fuss, or makes a fuss about that to this day? Because the actors did a good fucking job. Lincoln Clay from Mafia 3 is a black and Italian actor modeled by a Spanish voice actor, and the game is set in a racially insensitive time period. Do you know why no one made a fuss about the representation? Because the actor did a good fucking job. Do you know why people are making a fuss about Lily Gal's performance as Ada Wong? Because she did a bad fucking job.
Oh, Leon. You know I don't work in town.
No one is supposed to like you by default just because you're authentically casted or whatever the fuck. What does that have to do with the quality of the performance? You know who else was an authentically Asian cast actor in Resident Evil? Shin Mei. Guess what her actor did? A good fucking job.
You want to get dinner when this is all over?
Sure. But full disclosure, I have a young man waiting for me.
So,
it's classified. For now.
So it's not like people thought she sucked because of her ethnicity. Danny's actress in the Callisto Protocol did great work.
Thanks. I'll take my chances. A word of advice, though? Don't trust him. He's not what he seems.
The worst part of her response, by far, is this line about stopping capitalization on this sexualized, eroticized, and mysterious Asian woman. Yeah, that's cool and all, but then why the fuck did you read a contract to play the role of a sexualized, eroticized, and mysterious Asian woman and then sign it? Are we running our heads into the wall at full speed and complaining about skull fractures next? Good lord, man. She took the role of one of the most iconic, important, and fan-favorite characters in one of the biggest and best-selling gaming franchises ever made. Ada Wong has been around since 1998. I'm sorry we don't live in La La Land where that entire history has been wiped clean and you're never compared to what came before just because she wants to rewrite a character due to her own personal issues with her. I can load up this game right now and go jiggle Ada's tits and ass in her damn near see-through turtleneck where not a single dip or curve is left to the imagination, so don't try to bullshit me on her sex appeal like you started some groundbreaking revolution or something. I've heard some people say blame Capcom and the voice director, as if a person giving a shit performance isn't responsible for their shit performance, but I beg to differ. I pity this voice director. Listen to what he or she had to work with.
You. Leon S. Kennedy.
You can only redo so many vocal lines with one person telling them over and over again to try to do it again, but less like an alien pretending to sound human before you give up. Look your bosses directly in the face and say, dude, this is the best you can do. I give up. Just put it in the game. I'm going home to go take 3 times the recommended migraine medication and relieve this headache. This voice director didn't say anything, but I can only assume they were tortured dealing with this. I hope they got the raise they deserved after slogging through this session because they definitely deserved one. This is supposed to be her and Leon's makeup game after what happened between them in Resident Evil 2. They've got a lot of unspoken tension to get past. These characters, for the history of this franchise, have always struck in this balance between trying to do their jobs, trying to deal with their feelings towards one another that they'll never be able to really move on from. This is a retelling of a game where Ada Wong straight up blew her cover and compromised the mission to go save him, preceded by a retelling that retconned her being out of ammo to straight up refusing to shoot him, succeeded by another game where the man returns the favor. He came to blows with Chris Redfield to protect her, and this is the delivery we get from her, while Leon's actor is over here acting his ass off. What is that? I've been hard on her, but she's earned it. It's clear she doesn't love or respect the character, Ada's role, Ada's history, Ada's importance, or Ada's impact on the franchise. Her voice and tone she chose was just not right for the role, and if she stays, she stays. It is what it is, but it wouldn't surprise me if she's axed after this game. Evidenced by Shin Mei, there's plenty of other actors to choose from that can authentically represent Ada Wong simply by being Asian, if that's the thing we're caring about in this day and age, and still give a performance that's a little more seasoned and interesting than tap water. Hopefully she improves if they choose to keep her, but she's already sealed her fate as kind of being a controversial actress for this role that a lot of people are going to dislike. So I can't say I'm going to be torn up or surprised if they recast her in the future entries, or decide to keep her with every review for a game she's in the future having to mention her performance as being poor. You know you've done poorly when the Resident Evil modding community is scrambling to use AI to delete you from the game completely. Anyway, the ending stretch of the village is solid. Shaken up a bit, but also faithful. Instead of the dual routes, they just pick one and pick the right one. Technically they picked the left one, but you get what I mean. When collecting footage for the original, I had a feeling they picked this route during the remake, expand on it, and just axe the other route altogether. So that's what I went with, and surprise, surprise. I mean, really, if you had to pick one route to focus on remaking, why would you ever choose another El Gigante fight that you already used like 30 minutes earlier when you could pick the Chainsaw Sisters? And they do them justice. This is one hell of an entrance with a sick flip. I guess I'll take what I can get since the laser room got cut too. Then we have a brief chase trying to get away from Mendez and his minions before we square off. Thank fuck, and I mean thank fuck, that he was not turned into some pursuer enemy. It's a nice set piece, but they don't have him chasing you around the village and shit, unable to be shot, unable to be deterred, and just bothering you while you try to get things done. Because I am so fucking sick of that. It was tolerable with Jack, but ever since then they have just overdone this to the point of it just becoming annoying. One thing I didn't notice, and this is why I think it's always important to have more than one go-to for your gaming discussions and reviews, is that almost none of the bosses transform in front of you in this game. Up until I think Krauser. This is the type of thing, if you played the original, you probably didn't even realize, because the old transformations are so ingrained into your brain, especially if you've played them a million times, that it's not gonna dawn on you that you most likely didn't even see it happen, because you have that memory of it in your brain taken over. I don't know what gives here. I can't imagine this was done intentionally, because they can clearly do transformations in this engine. Maybe this was a decision made to make what they change into more mysterious for new players, but I think this is definitely the wrong decision. Maybe the director just has a hard-on for these mystery transformation shots, though I can't really say it's that big of a deal either, because the sentence, "I didn't like the remake because it didn't show boss transformations," would sound so fucking ridiculous coming out of somebody's mouth. But yeah, let's not make a habit of this. As far as the fight itself goes, we're solid. Dodge prompt's still on deck, he still breaks halfway through the fight, only he's given new attacks and will hang back a bit more to be less busted than he was before. Because this boss fight went from great to annoying as hell as soon as he broke apart in the original, basically becoming a war of attrition. Once we put him down and get to the castle, that's when things get a little different. This is arguably the act that changed the most story and design wise. The majority of it will be spent trying to meet up with Lewis. Hunnigan will lose communication with Leon for the rest of the game at a point here, and then it's mostly just contact with Ada and Lewis. Also at no point will Salazar and Sadler jack the line and banter with Leon. Sadler because he still hasn't been introduced yet, and will more interact with Leon through possession. Salazar because instead he will use phones on the walls throughout the castle to talk shit to him. I know this is seen as a big deal to some people, as there's lines and stuff from the original that are removed entirely, like, you know, your right hand comes off. But given the new serious tone of this remake, I'm not bothered, at least in the castle's case. Nothing about the castle ever really screams modern technology, so it never really made sense for them to scramble Leon's communication here and jack the line personally, talking to Leon in their own little Metal Gear Solid device. So I'm not surprised that it got the axe, because it was always kind of silly. Something had to give here. That being said, if they remake 5 and remove the boulder punch, then I might actually have to commit some crimes, because what the fuck. It still starts the same, only with a proper introduction to the head-eating Plagas now, instead of them just appearing out of nowhere randomly. We still blast our way in, but that part of the original where Leon walks into a room and Salazar orders a room full of enemies to gang up on him, is combined with meeting him for the first time. The machine gun room, the rocket launcher enemies in the castle, all that's been done away with. It's still paced the same, with us fighting the Garrador, only he's been introduced better, and in a much more horror-themed dungeon. The water room people seem to hate so much has been overhauled. Which is fine, it was pretty poorly balanced before. If you didn't know to funnel the enemies into this room and thin the herd down a bit before trying to turn the crank, I wouldn't even blame you if you took the disc out, snapped it in half, and shredded it in your sink's garbage disposal, because it was fucking rough on 8-year-old me when I first played this. There's new lore added on some kind of black slime here that's flowing in the water here, and they also make Ashley drink it later, but I can't really remember its significance. Speaking of new lore, the Salazar and Sadler families actually have history now, as they used to be rivals and enemies, with the Salazar families being the guardians of the plagas, and the substance that preserves them called amber. Amber is now what Wesker seems interested in, a sample of, not the plagas themselves. The latest Sadler managed to corrupt and manipulate the latest Salazar descendant into giving him access and joining him, from what I'm understanding here. Salazar's left and right hand are also explained. One of them is the family servant who sworn an oath to serve the Salazar family at all costs. And the other, likely the one we fight, is the family doctor, a mad scientist who experiments created the Navistadors. Once we get to the garden, things change. Ashley doesn't fall in the most ridiculous trap I've ever fucking seen that would have killed her at least 4 different ways if she was standing even slightly off anymore. Sadler actually takes control of her for a brief moment, and she attacks Leon, regains control, and runs off freaked out. Again, another reasonable, more grounded change. We then proceed to the most fucked up room in this game. This is what the Gatling gun room has been replaced with, and I fucking hate it, and what they've done with the Red Cultists. These guys are absolutely infuriating now. They slam their stupid fucking staff down, and whenever they do, they stun Leon out of whatever he's doing and force the Plagas transformations out of everyone that's programmed to spawn one in the room. Fuck these guys and what they stand for. We meet up with Ada finally here, and what should feel like 2 bitter exes happy to see each other but being passive aggressive about it, as one of Resident Evil 4's most important moments, is of course spoiled by Ada's voice. It's so distracting. I do like their fight. The old scene is fine, but this serves just as well. Big changes from here on out. There's a new set piece involving another El Gigante, so technically it wasn't really cut from the village, it was just repositioned to the castle. I like it, and I consider it compensation for them taking out the Sadler statue chase and turning it into a giant flamethrower. When we finish up here, we grab Ashley, and her and Leon have a pep talk. Everything's about what you would expect with no crazy changes until we complete the lion statue room. After that, it's Leon that gets captured, and he goes full beast mode in something lore accurate if the CGI movies are anything to go by. We then play as Ashley, and her section is completely overhauled. It's definitely longer initially, but more interesting too. She can use a lamp that the knights are weak to freeze them in place and keep them at bay. The best part is, you can cut this entire section down to about 80% of its usual time by inputting the clock code right at the start, once you know it on repeat playthroughs. I fucking wish Resident Evil 8 had something like this, because every time I have to slog through the baby section in the Benevito house, I just want to turn the game off. It's so tedious. She gets kidnapped by a Verdugo, and we're back on track. From here, business as usual. Dual Garradors, Salazar, everything. Once Leon is dropped in the pit, he has to deal with an expanded cave section with bugs that have changed their tactics a bit to accommodate being underwater and in the dark. You need to watch their glowing eyes. Afterwards, it's time for that right hand fight. Before I knew that the dodge prompts were still in the game, I was definitely concerned that this fight and it stalking you would be especially annoying, as you can no longer dodge stuff like it coming down off the roof or sticking its tail out of the water. But with them preserved, the same rules still apply. The difference now is that, whereas if the cryo canisters ran out, you were kinda fucked before, here they are reusable so long as he doesn't break one. I'm also gonna have to disagree with Boulder Punch here again on the prompts being inconsistent. As far as what you can dodge, neither Resident Evil 4 or 5 has ever been consistent with what you could dodge based off of prompts and what was a legit attack. 6 is the only consistent one, and that's because 6 leaves dodging entirely up to you. Outside of that, I don't find this any less wishy-washy or confusing than what you can and can't avoid with movement versus a prompt than the original. Once we escape this thing, we reach Lewis in the mines, who gives us medicine to buy us time and will be with us the whole time. The mine and mine cart ride chapters have been combined and blended up. And Lewis was always a character that deserved more screen time in the original, so I'm glad he's here. This is also an obvious test for AI mechanics and a partner for potential Resident Evil 5 remake, data, or even a Resident Evil 9 having co-op. One thing I'm noticing now that I'm thinking about it is that every normal chainsaw enemy design has returned, as of now, besides the blue jacket bloody one, the ridiculously long chainsaw from around this section of the game in the original. Here's hoping he makes an appearance in it separate ways. The minecart ride with Lewis is a bit more arcadey this time around, but a lot more bombastic as well. You're given his Red 9 with infinite ammo, and you guys ride around while he explains the Plagas and the history behind the mines. You guys crash land in the bug nest and fight your way out until Krauser shows up and takes Lewis out of commission instead of Sadler. Here we get a knife fight with him instead of the QTE fight from the original. Wasn't really sold on this at first in all the trailers after learning the QTEs were gone, but now I'm cool with it after playing it, especially because all the cool things and angles from the original fight are all still here, as well as some new sick stuff you can do. It's Lewis with his dying breaths that saves Leon this time around. And I gotta say, I like what a bigger role he's given in this game. He's an old researcher for Umbrella, and actually one of the smartest minds in this whole situation despite his wild personality. I'm pretty sure he's actually part of the team that worked on Nemesis. And he is, even after death, what saves Leon and Ashley, whereas before they just kinda ended up finding a random ass chair just before the final boss. Yeah, things have changed as far as how they play out, but I stand by how this makes Sadler less of an idiot for killing Lewis than just going, well, I guess Salazar will deal with you. The only thing that this does is deplete the connection between Ada and Leon by having her no longer disobey direct orders to let his assassination attempt play out and go save him. Next, we go through all the familiar beats to get to Salazar, only this time when we get to Salazar's fight, we physically see Krauser carry her away, as he's already been revealed to us earlier. That said, what the fuck happened to the other Verdugo? They're just gone. Am I missing something? They just never appear again after Leon gets dropped in the hole and are nowhere to be found in this fight as far as I can see. I don't really like this fight as much as the original either, at least if you play it the traditional way. It's fine, it's not really bad, but this black sludge bullshit that he shoots out now seems unavoidable sometimes. And it is really fucking irritating to get hit by. One thing fans have discovered is that Salazar is actually weak to eggs, specifically golden ones. Hinted at by the side mission that takes place in his throne room, if you throw one in his mouth, it will deplete like 70% of his life and make this fight way easier. From here, we hit up the boat and everything plays out as normal. The idea of this scene between Ada and Leon and the dialogue added is really good. This is the first time they've really talked about what happened and had a heart-to-heart. Leon wants to believe he's changed and become less of a hard-headed hero trying to do what's right all the time, and he asks her if she's changed, or if she's just trying to use him again to get what she wants. And in typical Ada fashion, her reply is to confuse and play with him a bit. Tell him he's still just that rookie cop she met and that he's still just trying to do the right thing, completely oblivious to what's really going on here. The answer to both questions is yes. Of course she's changed a little thanks to him, but of course she's still gonna use him to get what she needs. That's Ada 101. Leon knows that and says straight up, I'm not gonna get a straight answer. But thanks to Ada's voice actor, we get one of the most bipolar responses I've ever seen, where she basically growls at him for asking, and then halfway through the other line, it's like a switch flipped and the actor realized she was supposed to be flirting and just tried to adjust mid-sentence. Remember, Ada smiles at him when she says, what do you think? If I had to pick the worst moment for her performance and what it misdirected a scene, it would be this. This is the most important conversation him and Ada have for a long ass time to come, and this is what we get. And with that, we've reached the final act, the island, the act I will defend with my life as being the second best one in the original. And honestly, here it's no different. I've always considered the village to be the best act when you have all your starter weapons, as this is the main attraction. The castle is my least favorite, but that's because the castle has always had the most bullshit in it to deal with. And the third act is my second favorite because everything cranks up into overdrive here. Everything hits the hardest here. You'll fight the scariest creatures here. And the action is balls to the wall here. But to people who enjoy being boring, it's always been the worst section of the game, to the point where you had fucking cretins wanting the island section to be cut and or replaced. With as many videos as I've watched on the Resident Evil 3 remake of people whining like a bitch over cut areas and content, there is not a single reason any Resident Evil fan on planet Earth should have been asking for cuts for another remake. Oh, well, they can just cut the guns out. Salazar is building an army to do his building out of his cult, you dumb fuck. You know what sure makes an army strong? Guns! Bullets! Crazy, I know. What is he supposed to use against nations that catch on to his plan to spread plagas and control to the world? Send villagers over there with pitchforks? Jesus Christ! The issues the island section had weren't really the guns, it was the jank associated with dealing with it. There's like 2 sections in the entire original where you're allowed to take cover, and that became a problem real quick when dealing with the Gatling gunner. Speaking of the Gatling gunner, he's been nerfed. I was waiting to discuss this here, but there's a new type of enemy type that basically isn't new, but is just a reimagined brute from Resident Evil 5. They're sprinkled around the village section, but make a return here, and they've replaced the Gatling gunner with a Gatling arrow shooting brute. And while I'm glad they didn't cut him from the game, this just seems so whack. I was much more interested in seeing how the Gatling gunner would mix with a sandbox now that we can duck whenever we need to. Instead, they've just gutted him. In the original, when he first showed up, it was like, holy fuck, I know that is not what I think it is. Here, you barely even know what it is until he fires it. I'm not a fan. Another thing I'm not really feeling here is these new road-blocking tripwire guns that insta-kill you unless you change their direction. These don't really serve any purpose outside of slowing you down and getting in the way, but I guess they do kind of add to the military theme here. But again, it seems odd for them to have Gatling guns and then not have, JJ running around with a minigun. Other than those complaints, I like what they've done with the place. The layout is redesigned slightly, but it's still the island section I loved in the original, and it still feels massive when you finally get to the main gate. I wish I could wipe my memory and experience that feeling of walking into this prison area and recognizing instantly what room I was in. This act's redesign is a real treat for me. The enemies here have also been redesigned to bring them closer to their counterparts in Resident Evil 5. Remember that Resident Evil 5 is a Plagas game too, so you can actually see that they looked for inspiration there when designing Sadler's army this time around. And what they've done with the regenerators? Perfection. They can run now, dude. Outside of that, they didn't try to fix what wasn't broken. They still make the same sounds. And they've somehow managed to freak out both new and old players alike with what to expect. You run for your life against the first one since you don't have the thermal scope. Then you get to the freezer room and they lock you in this bitch with no thermal scope. You're losing your shit. You're like, where is it at? Get me out of here. And so now you're running for your life against 2 regenerators. And you enter a room with a bunch of them in tubes where not only do you grab the scope, but you need to get a tool from inside one of them, teaching you not only how to use the scope and about the plagas inside them, but acting as a tension builder for the other 3. Because once you use the tool, dynamite bros come pouring in and you're trying your best to take them out before one of these dumbasses blows up another tank and sets them free, or even worse, throws dynamite somewhere where they set more than one free, while you're scrambling for this keycard to be overridden. One of the best sections of this game by far. I will say again though, fuck these power door puzzles. We grab Ashley and run through some familiar rooms, one of which being the garbage disposal room, where we get our first taste of what they've done to the Iron Maiden. They're now a powered up transformation for the regenerators, that they can go into instead of being a separate enemy type. Much more dangerous, but as a trade-off you don't have to pop all their plagas again. When they transform, they have one final super plagas in their head to deal with, and that's it. The crane and bulldozer section have been combined into one. And once we're done with that, we head up to where we're finally introduced to Sadler face to face, where he makes it clear he's in control of things. He freezes Leon in place and forces Ashley to shoot. She resists it, but Leon is only saved by the gun jamming. And with that, let's talk about Sadler and his changes. In the original, he was introduced to Leon in Act 1, so he shows up a couple of times before Act 3, where him and Leon talk over the radio a lot. Which was fine, but in doing so, he not only looked stupid for never finishing Leon off anytime he showed up, but he was so cartoony it was hard to take him seriously as a threat or as a cult leader. This is supposed to be a religious deal where his cult worships the ground he walks on, but he just talked and acted like any old villain sitting on a throne in a bad guy chair. What they've accomplished by pulling him back now is allow his control over Plagas to do the talking. The staff he was carrying around in the original that seemed like he did absolutely the fuck nothing besides help him walk around here is clearly a tool to amplify his control over the parasites he's put into everyone. I don't mind the change. I can see the arguments against his lack of presence, but it's not like there's no pros and only cons to it. Krauser, on the other hand, I think is done way better than he was in the original. In the original, he was just made to be Leon's counterpart, but bulkier. He had no real motivations for doing what he was doing outside of some corny shit about charting a new course for the world or something. So I assume he's trying to retrieve the sample for Wesker's plans in Resident Evil 5. But him and Ada also had some weird hate thing going on, even though they're on the same side. But honestly, realistically, he was included so Leon would have a cool military agent to fight against that was just like him. Operation Javier wasn't even thought of yet when OG RE4 came out, so there's nothing in depth outside of just being a cool idea for a character at his core. Here, with the bonus of Operation Javier, which has been retconned to have been a whole squad and not just Krauser and Leon, we get a more personal and logical reason he's doing this. The US government disposed of everyone in that squad after the mission, if I read the documents correctly, except for Leon and Krauser, who defected and found Sadler and the Los Illuminados, who accepted him with open arms. He's not playing both sides this time. He's genuinely invested in Sadler's cult for his own reasons. For the power they provide, not for their religious bullshit. Leon was given special treatment by the government to work under the president. So as Krauser sees it, he signed up with the enemy, and they have to settle things like soldiers. And they do. When they're done, Leon earns Krauser's respect because he taught Leon everything he knows. Krauser goes from berating him as a rookie to finally calling him by his name in death. This is important for Leon because it means he's finally graduated from being inferior and inadequate to everybody around him in the eyes of one of the people he looked up to the most, even if they had their differences. Fights with Krauser are once again the best fights in the game, and I like this Krauser much more than the original. From here, we're in the home stretch again. I think how they've introduced Mike compared to how they introduced him in the original is a downgrade, undoubtedly. He doesn't have a grand interest like he did before. This is why when people act like they want less cutscenes in games and want more control, it's not really an argument I can get behind, because this is what you get as a result. What is an upgrade is his usefulness in gameplay, and the gameplay in general in this section. This part of the game before did have its issues in the original. It's what a lot of people had a problem with. The main of which being that bullets fucking hurt. I don't know if you know that. And in the original, Mike's AI in regards to what to shoot or blow up was terrible. Especially on higher difficulties, where he did absolutely the fuck nothing. And because Leon can duck whenever he wants now, you no longer have to awkwardly stand behind things. And it feels less like you're fighting with the game engine. But this section, thankfully, is intact regardless. RPGs, turrets alike. Most of which you can actually use for yourself now. It still sucks to be missing the signature Gatling gunner. Lames did rob me of that. But this section could have been ruined a lot worse by their fucking meddling, so I'll take what I can get. Mike still meets his end in a similar way, only instead of being shot down with rockets, Sadler swarms him with bugs. There's nothing wrong with this idea, but again, I do still prefer the original, because it better fits with the idea of Sadler using the Plagas infected as his own personal militia, even if the new one is the more Resident Evil thing to do. Leon and Ada no longer meet here so he can choke the life out of her anymore. I'll miss it, but it doesn't fit with how Sadler controls the Plagas anymore, so I get it. The final regenerator room has been overhauled and is now completely fucked up. There's a few hidden in these bags scattered across the room. There's a few hints, such as some of them moving or, being able to look through the thermal scope and tell which bags have regenerators in them. So if you're thinking of this stuff and paying attention, you'll have a better time. But on your first time through, you're likely not thinking about that sort of thing, and it's all too easy to get trapped in here, unable to get this door open since they run now. The final area is a little different too, as we've approached what I think is supposed to be the Sadler family castle, which is where they keep Ashley. They've moved her out of this weird lab container she was in the OG. Leon is almost out of time, and instead of doing this Matrix punch, he instead tortures Leon by trying to speed up his transformation. Ada saves him with a bit more emotion than paint drying, which is a first.
Leon! Go!
I know in the original game, the consistency for how much time Leon and Ashley had was all over the place, but here is really no better. If Leon is so out of time that all this goes on and he can barely walk, Ashley should honestly be too far gone by now. But it's always been this way with this game, so it is what it is. We make it to Louis's lab and can look around and read some of his notes, and it makes you really miss the guy. I like how things went with him way more in this game. Whereas before I never understood him being loved by the fan base with how little he actually does, legitimately to the point of dropping what he brought to help Leon and Ashley like a complete moron. I think what they've done with him here exposes how lacking his original version is. With that, we reach the end. Leon saves Ada and the final battle starts. Sadler actually seems far more pissed that Leon removed the Plagas this time around, which always bothered me about his original. I found it easier and harder than the final battle in the weirdest ways. The end goal is still the same and the strategies are still the same, but what's different is he can shoot Salazar's annoying ass black goop that is extremely hard to deal with, and partway through the fight he calls these stupid ass bugs in. There's just a lot to deal with now, and while you try to focus fire on his weak points. I think these Novistadors were added because they're the logical solution to give you ammo and supplies, but they could have toned down just how many there are. After we put him down, he's actually not done this time. We get one final DPS stretch where we need to unload everything we have, and then Leon does the sickest shit I've ever seen him do in the games, and something straight out of Devil May Cry. And I'm delighted to see the Resident Evil I know, the one I love, back in full force. Resident Evil 3's boss finish was good too, but I haven't seen a boss finish this beautiful. Something that made me go, this franchise is a work of art. Since the Eustanak kicks Jake's gun into the lava in 6, and they had a full bare knuckle brawl. After 7 and 8 watered down everything and gave lamer boss finishes where they just grabbed you up and you spam shots until they died, you don't understand how good it feels to finally have this back. To have characters I love doing the shit I fell in love with this franchise to see them do. Chris Redfield in the Winner's duology was stuck somewhere where it felt like he had shackles on and couldn't do the stuff I'd known him to do from Resident Evil 5 to Revelations. I don't give a fuck if him punching a boulder was quote unquote ridiculous. People remember it. It's a beloved moment, which is why people went crazy for the Easter egg in 8 where Heisenberg brought it up. But in 7 and 8, the best they could do to make Chris feel like Chris was to just have him do more damage than Ethan. Resident Evil 7's Not a Hero DLC tried, but it was still confined to the cage that was Resident Evil 7's gameplay. But now we're back, and the people that took this from me can fucking blow me. Cause like I've always said, this action horror thing rules. Once again, this game is hailed as one of the greatest ever made, and a masterpiece. And you can bet your sweet ass Resident Evil 4 Remake is going to influence the direction the series goes in, just like the original did all those years ago, as it fucking should. Jared can expect to cope and seethe for years to come. This game was a massive success, a bigger launch than even the Resident Evil 2 remake. This is the second biggest launch in Resident Evil history, right behind 6. I am so glad they proved me wrong here. They didn't fuck it up. They changed some things, rearranged some things, reimagined some things. But it is a mostly balanced pros and cons trade-off. That puts it right up there next to the original as not only one of the best Resident Evils ever made, but one of the best games ever made. But it's clearly not without issues. You may have noticed, but there was no mention of the U3 or the It. And that's because it was entirely cut. It's not in the game at all. And I have no idea why, because this is one of the most memorable bosses. If you ask me, I would have cut out the El Gigante and the castle entirely to put in U3. but word on the street in the back alley is that this boss is likely retooled for the Separate Ways campaign, which by the way is not in the game right now. I expected that, and I don't mind them charging for it this time around, but the paper-thin defense for why that is absolutely fucking ridiculous. The idea that this is based on the original release, so how dare anyone be upset or expect it to be in the game, is so smooth-brained, I can't believe there are people that type this out. People that look at it, proofread it, and press send on it. And I actually like Selena, but this tweet and the quote tweet after it is fucking ridiculous and gets destroyed by any sort of close examination. So let's entertain and work off the defense that this is based on the original GameCube port. It's a fucking dumb defense, as Capcom has made sure to include all content on every single port since the PS2 one, and every port since then has been based on the GameCube code, and no one forced the GameCube players, like me, to go out and get a PS2 version or a PS3 version or any other port. That was included for free for new players. But let's entertain this defense for a second. You know what else was in the original release? Mercenaries. Well, the game didn't launch with Mercenaries, but it's here now because I took so fucking long to write this script. It's a lot of fun, and it's nice to have a playable Luis. 6 still has the best Mercenaries mode by far, but this is up there. And this is way better balanced than the original Resident Evil 4. But you know what was in that original GameCube release? The docs, Ada and Wesker. All of which are missing in Mercenaries this time around. Why? Because they're being held back for no other reason than Separate Ways. Which, remember, wasn't in the GameCube release. But Ada and Wesker were still playable in the original Mercenaries mode, as was the docs. So that's strike one. Leon's RPD costume. Where's that at? That was in the GameCube release. That should have been a no-brainer. And a piss-easy inclusion. They just made Resident Evil 2 Remake not that long ago. This was an easy-peasy asset flip of the remake's gear, and it's still not here. Strike 2. GameCube owners might not have gotten Separate Ways, but you know what we did get? Assignment Ada. Now admittedly, this became redundant the moment Separate Ways was included on PS2, but remember, this is based on the original GameCube release. We are to put re-releases out of our mind. So, where's it at? That's strike 3 for this stupid ass fucking argument. Throw it in the slammer, that's life. So yes, this is a masterpiece, reborn as yet another masterpiece. But we are going to have to wait a while for it to be complete. And while Separate Ways this time will likely cost money, it's not like they haven't given separate characters their own episodes free of charge before, but they've also still charged for it before, so we'll just have to see. Alright, so I've examined Dead Space's remake and Resident Evil 4's remake. Stomped on a lot of heads, likely pissed off enough people, so let's talk about which I think is a better remake. And I reiterate, one being a better pick at what it sets out to do does not make the other one bad. Someone has to lose, and that's okay. A champ world boxer that just lost a match against another one could still whoop your fucking ass while you try to talk about how much he sucks. But someone has to lose the fight here. So in between these two diamonds, which do I think is the better remake? I'm gonna go with Dead Space on this one, and I'll explain why. Because between the two, Dead Space is the most complete of the two games right now. Sure, it has less content overall, but there's no sections or bosses that have been removed, no cut weapons or outfits from the base game or anything like that. I can't really say the same for the Resident Evil 4 remake. You can say I have a bias because, like I've said, the Dead Space franchise is just a little better than Resident Evil to me. But clearly, based on how much I've talked about my love for 4, 5, and 6, and how strong of a bias I have for those games, I don't think it's the same kind of bias as an old head saying he doesn't like Resident Evil 5 because it has too much fucking action while he plays, Resident Evil 1 jerking himself off. I think I'm being completely fair here. But I also think Resident Evil 4 Remake has created a bigger problem for Capcom than people realize because of how good it is. It's arguable that it's better than the original. And I do think for the most part it is better than the original. But the key word there was arguable. The original for the most part still plays like a modern game outside of movement problems, with a modern control scheme on by default for recent ports to consoles, and easily swapped to on PC. That means it's still easily accessible to the modern audience in a way that the original 3 games can never be. Just the other day, I was talking to this chick that started the franchise with the Resident Evil 2 and 3 remakes, because of how they play, and that they're over the shoulder like every other modern game she's played. Do you think that she gives a fuck that the clock tower was cut in the Resident Evil 3 remake? Or that the separate scenarios in the Resident Evil 2 remake are missing most of their A and B scenario differences? No. That's the modern generation of gamers today. They don't give a fuck. Some of them are just not going to start with Resident Evil 1's remake because they don't want to deal with that. They don't want to deal with the angles, they don't want to deal with the tank controls. Capcom has tried to make it a little easier with a modern updated control scheme, but for a lot of them that's just not going to be enough. And you cannot force them to, and there's nothing wrong with that. But the original Resident Evil 4 was in a unique position of still being modern enough to start with, and led straight into Resident Evil 5 story and gameplay wise. If you've played the original Resident Evil 4, you could start Resident Evil 5 and play it just fine, because it was just 4 with co-op. 6 was the mainline entry start of being able to move and shoot, and from there and forward, everything else really plays just fine and hasn't aged all that bad outside of visuals. Now that they've done this remake, they've kind of shot themselves in the foot, because once again, Resident Evil 4 is their masterpiece. The game that every game they drop from here on out will have to live up to and be compared to. This new Resident Evil 4, just like the OG, is the breakout hit that is the start of a lot of people getting into Resident Evil. Which means that Resident Evil 5 is the only of the over-the-shoulder games left where you still plant your feet down like a fucking moron whenever you need to take aim. It was a problem in 2009, but now it's even worse of a problem in 2023. If Capcom hadn't been so fucking hard-headed, we wouldn't even need a remake for this game. Because I still think the PS3 and 360 era visually has aged just fine in comparison to the PlayStation 1 and 2 eras in a similar time frame, which is why remasters of these games always look so good. Look at Halo 4, look at Gears of War 3, look at Crysis 3, look at Far Cry 3. You're fucking insane if you think this era doesn't still have some good fight in it. There's a reason most of these remastered ports of this era just cranked all the game's graphic settings up to PC levels and then up-res everything to 4K. But they are highly likely to remake Resident Evil 5 now. They kinda have to. They have a new Wesker ready and willing for a reason. Putting Luis and his AI through the whole minecart chapter was for a reason. While that's great for me because I fucking love Resident Evil 5, that's horrible for Code Veronica players since it likely means that you're never getting one. Again, let me repeat, the remake of Resident Evil 4 has been a massive success. But what that also means is that a Code Veronica remake, even if it was good, would feel like a massive backpedal and downgrade from 4. It would be reviewed worse than 4. It would sell worse than 4. Because the gameplay is going to have to be slower. It's going to have to be more in line with Resident Evil 2 Remake. And that's not going to appeal to more of the gaming market than a game that plays like Resident Evil 4. You don't have to fucking like it, but it is what it is. I'm not going to lie to you and tell you the shit that you want to hear, not what you need to hear. And you already know journalists and YouTube channels that just live off of looking for headlines are going to blow up a situation 10 times worse than it actually is. Blowing up every flaw in a Code Veronica remake as some major fucking issue, and blowing up it selling less than 4 as some massive fucking failure or something. Trust me, if someone like Young Ye finds out that the Code Veronica remake sold less than Resident Evil 4 remake, that motherfucker is sprinting, tripping over furniture in his house to get in front of that webcam and blow up the controversy. That's his specialty. On top of that, Capcom does not really give a fuck about Code Veronica as it is. But they really don't give a fuck about Code Veronica now. Look at it this way. They got two options. Remake Resident Evil 5, what was your best-selling entry and one of the most popular entries in the franchise, where you can easily and safely do what you did before with 4, make it play like 4, but with co-op that people are begging you for in 4's mercenary mode right now. Something that a good portion of RE fans have been missing since 6, a game that requires a complete overhaul like Resident Evil 2 and 3 remakes did, and is one of your least popular entries. I think Code Veronica is the second worst entry in this franchise right next to Resident Evil 0, but I still want Code Veronica to get one, because it deserves one for the people that enjoy it, and its fans. It's not a numbered entry, so there's a lot of Resident Evil players when it comes to this franchise, especially newer ones, and ones that aren't always on the fucking internet, that don't know it exists, or isn't a spin-off, because it sounds like a spin-off. But it is a crucial entry, especially for Chris and Claire. I'm not so damn selfish that I think it doesn't deserve a remake just because I'm not its biggest fan like Susie here. Yes, this is a real thing she has said, that she doesn't think Code Veronica deserves a remake because it wasn't personally her cup of tea, and you wonder why I don't fucking like this chick. I want a Code Veronica remake to exist, but to do that, that means stepping backwards from 4's gameplay, and not forwards from it. And while that's great for people who prefer that, they're not gonna do that because they're not stupid. They know it will sell less. And why would they sell less when Resident Evil 5 is right there ready to sell more and be better received? If they ever did do a Code Veronica remake, it's for sure it would just be a throwaway team now. The gameplay will be its biggest problem. They can't work a knife parry or the melee system from 4 into Code Veronica. The best it could do to maybe feel a little less stiff is get the dodge mechanic from the remake of 3. But in all honesty, a Code Veronica remake is probably dead in the water now, and that's a shame. I mean, it's great for me, because action horror RE fans are eating great right now. I'm getting what I want. Capcom couldn't even make it through Resident Evil 7's story DLC without feeding me. But while yeah, it's funny and fun for me to virtually teabag survival horror game gatekeepers, since Capcom is catering to my demographic more than them, as they should, I do think that those fans deserve one last bone in the form of Code Veronica before they just have to hold the L until the end of time. When it comes to Dead Space, the original plays better and more like a modern game than the original Resident Evil 4, no doubt, but the remake has created no problems. Dead Space 1 Remake is a more modern game than Dead Space 2, sure, but Dead Space 2 and 3 have not aged so poorly and so distantly outside of visuals, much in comparison. This is why I'm firmly against a remake of Dead Space 2, because people get a good thing and they start running the fuck out, not understanding the risks in what they're asking for. Dead Space 2 was the blueprint used for Dead Space 1's remake. You don't go from 1's remake to 2 and feel restricted the same way you'll go from Resident Evil 4's remake to 5. Dead Space 2 and 3 need remasters on modern consoles so that players are brought up to speed and can comfortably get caught up if a Dead Space 4 is decided on. What do you lose going from Dead Space 1 Remake to Dead Space 2? As of now, if you're a new player. Not much. The cutscene presentation is the same. Isaac's behavior and character is the same. Combat is damn near identical outside of weapons having different alt-fire modes. The set pieces and crazy moments are all still here and cranked up even crazier. What is there to add to Dead Space 2 in the form of a remake? Interconnectivity? Backtracking? Side missions? Why? Because that's what should be in every horror game and that's mandatory now or something stupid like that? This is how I know people are fucking morons and don't think. Let's think about this for a second. In Dead Space 2, a third of the game is about Isaac's brain killing him. He doesn't have time to skip and go explore the mall real quick he just passed by, because that's what a Resident Evil game would do. The person who said that they will cure him has given him a definitive route to their location. His goal is to get there as quickly as possible. There's a fucking military gunship chasing him. He's taking effective routes throughout the city to avoid soldiers and officers that have been ordered to kill him on sight. Then there's the second third of the game, where his goal is to get to the government sector. Isaac doesn't fumble around the city looking for a way there. Because he's a man with a functional brain. He makes a smart plan to get there and executes it. At a certain point, Tideman cuts off all life support. Do you think Isaac Clarke has time to do a fucking side mission before he suffocates to death? No! Again, he makes a smart plan and he executes it. Do you understand what I'm saying to you? This worked in Dead Space 1's remake because Isaac is stuck on one ship where it's easy and no-brainer to add a side mission where you look for Nicole or get security clearance to go back and get new supplies to help your survival. This doesn't work for Dead Space 2 because it doesn't fit into the narrative. Adding it in because you have some closed-minded viewpoint on what you think every single horror game should be does nothing for this game. There's a million different ways this could go wrong for them, and not enough ways this can go right. They can't get all the old voice actors back, so inevitably that's going to change and piss someone off. Imagine if they can't get Ellie's voice actor back. From what I'm seeing, they can't really add things to Dead Space 2. They can only subtract things from Dead Space 2 to appease people that don't like how much over the top and action-packed it is compared to 1. But considering Dead Space 2 is the biggest hit for the original trilogy before the remake happened, that is the dumbest thing they could do. You don't remake a game to water it down for bitches. You remake a game to try to improve it. So then what? Remake Dead Space 3 instead and skip over 2? What the fuck does that solve? Dead Space 3 is already more interconnected than Dead Space 2, looping back on itself a lot. That box is already checked. The game already has side missions, so that box is already checked. The only thing they can do is what? Change the weapon system back to the previous entries? Yeah, I'd like that a lot, but that is a dumbass reason to waste your time remaking an entire game. I know in the YouTube video essay sphere, the echo chamber where everyone is a minion of whatever the fuck their favorite content creator is and just parrots whatever they say about a game, this idea might be unfathomable. But there are people that enjoy Dead Space 3. There are a lot of people that actually like it. I still find games all the time of people playing it when I'm looking for co-op. There are people that enjoy the weapon building system and its combat. The goal of a remake is usually to please both its original fans and bring in new people alike, not to appease the people that didn't like it. If you didn't like it, that's your business. There are parts of it that I don't like the weapon building system. But don't let this internet shit fool you into thinking that everyone hates whatever entry in whatever franchise is considered to be the black sheep. Like all these fucking clickbait ass YouTube thumbnails would have you believe. There is this thing called reality. Take a break from worshiping your game review overlords and take a step into it sometimes. And you'll be surprised to find that oftentimes people don't all fucking think the same. Or like or hate the same things. Crazy, I know. Stomping your feet and demanding a remake of a game not because it's aged poorly but because you didn't like it is bitch behavior. I'm sorry. I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. Their efforts would be much better suited to a Dead Space 4. Or here's an idea. You know that beloved Dead Space mobile game that's fondly remembered for being a prequel to Dead Space 2 and one of the best mobile games ever made? For being as close to a console quality game as you could get. With its own unique rigs, and some sick-ass weapons exclusive to it that have never been seen in a Dead Space game since, like the plasma saw and heavy pulse rifle. The one that is removed from sale and unable to be experienced today. Why not remake that instead? Carrie Norton is one of the most unique and interesting characters this franchise had. She was a devoted unitologist that they tricked into starting the Sprawl outbreak in the first place, killing all the people that it killed in Dead Space 2. She absolutely deserves to have her story brought to a modern audience through a proper game because it was just so good. They get entirely more freedom to flex their creative muscles, and they don't risk pissing off fans of a beloved entry in the series. They could easily do this to test the waters for interest in a proper Dead Space sequel, and just port Dead Space 2 and 3 at 4K 60 FPS to modern consoles. And then everyone is brought up to speed, and we're all good to go for a Dead Space 4. Since they can't just introduce an entire new generation to Dead Space 1 through the remake, and then jump straight into 4 without catching them up on everything that's happened since then. Do you see how simple it was to think of an idea that kept the individual person's favorite entry intact, whatever it may be, and also gave some interesting ideas on what to do next that isn't just, you remade one, remake the next one now, without just living in Wonderland and not really thinking of the risks. But yes, rant aside, Dead Space 1 is the better remake, taking into account what it set out to do and how it preserves the gameplay of what comes next by bringing a little of what comes next into what came before. Resident Evil 4's remake, while still being an absolute masterclass work of art, is for sure going to leave Resident Evil 5 in the dust if they don't remake it. Whereas before, while some people did still prefer Resident Evil 4, not only did some people prefer 5 more, but 5 wasn't too far of a transition between the two entries. And it is completely understandable to prefer one or the other since they didn't reinvent the wheel when they made 5. 5 is still playable and still plays like a modern title, don't get me wrong, just like the original still plays like a modern title, but you get what I'm saying. You're getting less of a graduation of gameplay going from the original 4, you're getting going from 4 remake to 5. And in regards to the remake of 4, it still does have the same attitude, the same spirit, and the same action, but it does have a different tone, a different art style, and it's a lot more grounded. It's also missing things. And I already knew it was going to divide people when it was announced, as far as which one is better. Because this isn't the same kind of remake as the Resident Evil 1 remake that just adds things. This one removes things. Arguably, the Dead Space 1 remake is more like the Resident Evil 1 remake. And that's why I always said that 4 didn't need one. When you go fucking with what is considered to be as close as you can get to perfection, you have the smallest chance of remaking that perfection again. And this game somehow still gets as close as possible, mostly because it's still Resident Evil 4 at its core, and that ratio between what it adds and subtracts is mostly still balanced out. This just isn't a definitive replacement without a doubt for the original, the same way Resident Evil 1's remake is, at least right now because it's still incomplete. It's a reinterpretation of it. You can reinterpret a masterpiece into another masterpiece, but there's still going to be people that preferred what you had before. Best you can do is accommodate them by keeping the original available so they'll shut the fuck up about it. But my generation that was raised on Resident Evil 4 is already getting old and phasing out. I'm gonna be 27 this year. So eventually, in time, when someone refers to Resident Evil 4, as the other one is phased out and it's made less available, and trust me, it will happen, they'll be referring to this one, not this one. It's unavoidable. You can scream into the void about how much you prefer the original. You can be a little bitch like Krobkuck, misrepresenting and doctoring footage in your comparison between games because you need those YouTube dollars. But the reality is time is ticking against you and you can do nothing to stop it. Because this remake is becoming just as beloved as the original, and this will be what newer fans grow up with. It is what it is. I haven't made the mistake that classic Resident Evil fans have made of being unable to accept that. And I think, since inevitably that's going to be the case, this is a damn fine way to do it. I think that right now, we should be thankful that at the end of the day, even if you grew up with Resident Evil 4, or grew up with Resident Evil 1, as far as introductions to their respective eras in Resident Evil, those that'll come after us are still getting a mostly faithful adaptation of their respective eras. But, like I said, Capcom is in a pickle now, because the smartest thing to do is to basically just tell Code Veronica fans to eat shit now. They've emptied the tanks, they've blown the load when they should have did that one first. That being said, this is the best of the Resident Evil remakes by far. Of course it is. It's Resident Evil 4. But yeah, that's what I think of things. You can't go wrong with either of these, they're both great. And with this and the Callisto Protocol being out, it's just so good to be back. It's good to have my action back, blend it with my horror. It's good to have good combat in horror games back. It's good to not feel like I need to force myself to slog through not liking certain sections of the latest Resident Evil games every time I want to replay them again. It's good to have Dead Space back. It's good to have motherfuckers that fight back in my horror games again. I haven't been this happy with horror games since I was a teenager. Or this happy with gaming in general. Just flipping back replaying Dead Space 1, 2, and 3, and replaying Resident Evil 4, 5, and 6 over and over and over again on my PS3 all day, every day, when I got home from school, barely doing any homework. Because homework is fucking stupid, and why would I do that when I could just play these games and copy the homework from whatever girl I happen to be dating at the time? It's good to be back, boys. As always, if you've made it to the end, thanks for putting up with my shenanigans, and I'll see you soon. My next course of action is to examine the Evil Within's current duology. Resident Evil is by far the bigger franchise, with a lot of main entries, so there's no way I can just cram them all into one video. This script alone was 40 fucking pages long, man. Are you kidding me? I want to cover the Evil Within next, kinda to hone my skill a bit more at this video game discussion thing, since I'm still finding my rhythm before I do something major like Resident Evil. But yeah, expect that next. I'll see you guys around.
The Callisto Protocol is a beat-em-up third-person shooter action game with light, and I mean light, survival horror mechanics. Beat 'em up.